Thank you. So good evening or good morning, depending on where you are in the world. My name is Daniel Johnson, and I work for the U.S. Department of Energy's International Non-Proliferation Export Control Program. As part of my job, I'm currently working with partners in Southeast Asia, including Singapore, on implementing strategic trade control systems. So I'm very much looking forward to this event. So I'll be your host and facilitator. So I'd like to start by welcoming all of you to this 2021 Joint Industry Outreach Seminar held in partnership with Singapore Customs, Japan's Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry, and 3 U.S. Cabinet departments, the Department of State, Department of Commerce, and the Department of Energy. So team members from all of these countries and organizations have been working diligently together since early this year to organize this event. So let me start by offering a big thank you to the organizing team. It's truly been a collaborative process with key contributions from all of the partners. I'm sorry we couldn't hold this event in person due to ongoing challenges related to COVID, but working remotely has its own benefit in that more people are able to join than usual, and we can reach a broader audience. In fact, we have a record number of registrations to participate this year, around 900, and it looks like we have about 560 people already logged in. So we're very excited by the great turnout. And I think the excitement around this year's event demonstrates the value that participants have been finding from these discussions over the years. And we do aim to hold the JIO again next year, which to my understanding is the 10-year anniversary of this event. So hopefully we'll be able to see many of you in person then. Next slide, Julie. Let's begin with a few housekeeping items. Because there are so many attendees, everyone except the presenters will be muted and have their cameras shut off for the event. I know it's quite a bit more fun to be able to turn on your camera and interact directly with the presenters, but there are just too many people. So we will discuss how to share your questions in a moment. Please note that this seminar is being recorded. This helps Singapore Customs and other partners to ensure that we capture all of the questions and we're able to follow up with everyone, as well as gather lessons learned for dissemination after the event. I would also like to mention that many government institutions will participate in this event. I'm sure everyone here is aware of the need to carefully handle sensitive information, and as such, participants are asked not to share any classified information as part of the discussions. Next slide, please, Julie. We are using WebEx events for the seminar, and I'm sure everybody here is quite familiar with this or similar webinar software at this point. As previously mentioned, participants are muted, so you will need to submit your questions to presenters and panelists through the Q&A function on the lower right quadrant of your screen. So please select the drop-down menu and adjust your selection to send your questions to all panelists. So during every panel session, we will try to make time for Q&A, and we have team members dedicated to reviewing your questions and providing them to our panel moderators. So you can submit your questions at any time during the presentations and discussions. So please do participate that way. Also, please do not get offended if we do not get to one of your questions. We may have too many questions to answer, or we might run out of time. However, we will try to follow up with you directly in the Q&A box or after the event. Next slide, please. Organizing your viewing experience with the webinar software is probably quite familiar for many of you by now. However, let me provide a couple of recommendations to help you have the optimal viewing experience. First, I suggest you choose the side-by-side view from the layout menu. This will allow you to see both the speakers and their presentations at the same time. I also suggest that you hide participants not on video. So uncheck the Show Participants Without Video box. This will help focus in on the speakers and clean up your screen a bit. So my hope is that we do not run into any technical difficulties today, but as we all know, the best laid plans often go awry. So if you are having technical difficulties, please feel free to submit that information in the Q&A box, and we'll see if there's something we can do to help. Next, please. Okay, let's take a very brief look at the agenda for the event. For day one, we have a full slate of speakers, starting with opening remarks from distinguished senior representatives, and followed by 3 diverse panels on U.S. export controls, sanctions, and emerging technology. Then a panel on cyber threats and managing risks to the supply chain. And finally, a panel on developments in strategic trade regulations and controls. Next, please. So before we begin, I would like to orient you all on using the polling function. So we're going to run a few polls throughout the event, and we're going to try to run a couple here just to get to know you. So look on the lower right side of your screen next to the QA box, and there should be a couple of polls that have popped up. The first question there is, from what region are you joining this event? And then the second question is, what topic are you most interested in learning about related to this seminar? So please take a moment and select where you're from and what topic you're interested in. Then after about 10 seconds, I'll ask my colleague Julie Marchand, who is our producer for the event, to close the poll. Okay, Julie, why don't you go ahead and close that poll now, and we can take a look at the results. Okay, great. So as expected, we have the largest audience from Southeast Asia, probably many of you from Singapore, but we also have a large contingent from all over the world. So that's very exciting. This is truly a global event. And if we look at the topics that everyone's interested in, there's quite a broad interest in all of the topics we will be discussing. I note that the updates on national STC laws and regulations is of the highest interest, so maybe the panelists on that session can take note of that. All right, Julie, next, please. So what we'll do is we'll start with opening remarks from very distinguished senior officials from the United States, Japan, and Singapore, and they will highlight important topics that we'll need to consider for this seminar. For our first speaker, we have Mr. Rafiq Mansour, Chargé d'Affaires at the U.S. Embassy in Singapore. So Mr. Mansour will be joining us by video presentation. So we're going to start up his video in a moment here. For those inspiring remarks. As Mr. Mansour said, this is really a true example of cooperation between like-minded international partners in both government and industry to ensure secure international trade. So next up, we have Mr. Jun Kazeki, who is the Director General of the Trade Control Department at the Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry of Japan. Mr. Jun, we look forward to hearing your remarks. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Jun Kazeki, Director General of Trade Control Department, Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry. On behalf of the Japanese government, I would like to take this opportunity to offer opening remarks. First, I would like to express my sincere appreciation for the efforts of the Singapore Customs, the U.S. Department of State, the Department of Commerce, and the Department of Energy in organizing this seminar, as well as the efforts of the export control officials of the governments and industries that are interested in participating in this meeting. The theme of this seminar, Strategic Trade Management, is a measure to prevent proliferation of weapons mass destruction and their means of delivery, as well as destabilizing accumulations of conventional weapons. The introduction of this measure has been an obligation of UN member states since the adoption of the UN SCR 1540 in 2004. It aims to prevent illicit procurement activities by countries of concern and terrorists that impede regional security. Sound implementation of these measures by each country has contributed to ensuring security in many areas of the world, including Asia, Middle East, Africa, and Latin America. In addition to preventing destabilization in these regions, export control has recently been attracting attention as a way to prevent illegal transfers of emerging technology and sensitive technologies. Protecting sensitive technologies that are important for each country is closely related to national security. And from this perspective, the importance of strategic trade management is growing worldwide. To implement export control on strategic goods and technologies effectively, countries that have the ability of supplying those goods and technologies must harmonize their approaches. If one country does not stop the export or transfer of the item or technology which was stopped by other countries, the export control efforts will not work effectively against procurement actions by entities of concern. While each country adopts its own national security export control rules, it is essential to implement them in a coordinated manner with other countries. Multilateral export control regimes exist for this purpose, but the number of member countries is limited. In order to take a coordinated approach for effective strategic trade management, it is necessary to promote mutual understanding of each country's strategic trade management and share the best practices of it. This seminar is a very important platform for that purpose. Details of each country's export control laws and regulations and timely topics, such as intangible technology transfer, will be introduced. Information sharing, including best practices, will contribute greatly to the strengthening of strategic trade management in the Asian region, as well as enhancing common understanding regarding harmonized implementation of each country. This seminar has been held in person for many years. However, with the widespread impact of COVID-19, the seminar was held online last year. Taking advantage of the online meeting, it has provided an opportunity for even more countries and participants. As you may know, Japan has been hosting the Asian Export Control Seminar, which is also a long-standing platform for information sharing, including best practice on export control. It will be held online next February 2022. We are learning by seeing this seminar as one of the excellent and successful precedents for online meetings. Finally, I would like to conclude my remarks by expressing my hope that this seminar will provide a fruitful opportunity for discussion by introducing the latest approaches to export control and sharing best practices on challenging issues. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Jun, for sharing your thoughts with us and giving us these very important high-level reasons why we need to focus on export controls, from the UNSCR resolutions to control of key technologies to harmonization of systems between countries. So that was very, very helpful to start us out. Thank you, sir. Next up, to give our final opening remarks, we have Mr. Lim Tek Leong, the Deputy Director General of Singapore Customs, and we very much look forward to your remarks, sir. Mr. Lim.
Thank you, Daniel. Yep. Morning to friends, colleagues who are based in Southeast Asia, and evening to other friends who are based in the US or other parts of the world. Unfortunately, Mr. Murphy also couldn't be with us, but nonetheless appreciate his recorded opening remarks. Morning to you, Mr. Jun Kazaki, Director General, Trade Control Department, Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry, Japan. Good to see friends from DOE, BIS, XBIS, see a lot of familiar names, even from the participants from companies. Very good to see all of you here again in this year's seminar. Distinguished speakers and other guests and new participants, ladies and gentlemen. I think first on behalf of Singapore Customs, I would like to extend a warm welcome to all participants to this year's Joint Industry Outreach Seminar, which I think has been shared, is jointly brought to you by US Bureau of Industry and Security, US Export Control and Related Border Security, US Department of Energy, Japan Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry, and Singapore Customs. I think as what earlier Daniel has said, similar to last year's seminar, this year's seminar has been held virtually, and doing so, of course, it benefited us in the sense that it's more far-reaching, able to invite more speakers from all around the world, as well as increase the number of participants. I understand that this year is a record year. Of course, on the downside of it is that we can't have the usual physical interactions, can't see all of you face to face and have the lunch and things like that. But no, everything always has a trade-off, right? But on this note, I think I'd like to take this opportunity to thank the speakers and audience for taking the time and effort to attend today's seminar. Despite the time zone difference for some of you, and now you are based in America, you have to work at 8+ p.m. Yeah, taking some of the sleep time. The earlier speakers, I think, have sort of highlighted the importance of export control. Many of you are here, I suppose, because you know the importance of export control. That's why you're here. But though I just personal note, I've thought of curious that in the poll that was done just now in the first part in the morning, for the second question on the topics that you guys are interested, a high percentage of them indicated there's no answer. So that's perplexed to me. I'm not so sure whether the topics that we present here are things that are relevant or what you're interested in, but nonetheless. Okay. I won't underscore too much the importance of export control, but just highlight a few key points. I think against a backdrop of current pandemics, global disruption to the global economy, geopolitical tensions continue to be of concern to global trade. Today, we are still facing some uncertainties from the US, China-Australian tensions, and so forth. Also, following the US withdrawal from Afghanistan and Taliban takeover, there's still uncertainties of situation. Read the news, security agencies are keeping a close eye on developments in Afghanistan. Closer to this region, we have North Korea, as you read in the newspaper reports, continue to develop its nuclear and ballistic missile programs in the first half of this year and continue doing so. So I think all these developments even highlight the importance of strategic trade management to counter proliferation of weapons, strategic goods, including WMDs. WMD proliferation is among some of the gravest threats to global security and regional stability. Proliferation states and terrorist networks continue to seek and to acquire deadly and destructive weapons in increasingly creative ways, exploiting the vulnerability of interconnected global trading systems. Profitators are always on the lookout for liberal trading environments and unsuspecting suppliers to circumvent existing trade restrictions. Thus, while the regulators continue to facilitate trading activities and also of legitimate industry players, as well as enhance our regulatory control, I think there is still always a pressing or important need for regulators and industry players to collaborate together to remain vigilant and prevent the supply chain being misused by the proliferators. Earlier, I think Mr. Rafim also highlighted the importance of the industry to having robust and adequate industry compliance program to keep a lookout, to be eyes and ears, to tell us if they see anything amiss so we can tackle this problem together. I think this particular aspect or element of a good strategic export control regime is still relevant in today's context. And that's why this year we have this industry outreach seminar. Back to the agenda, I think we have laid out a few items. Let me briefly go through them as well as explain why we have sort of laid out the various items. I think first of all, I think we have some environmental scanning this year. We noticed that May this year, several countries have made announcements to express their stand on the situation in Myanmar. So it's a great pleasure. We have several experts from the US today to share on the restrictions imposed on Myanmar and the military end user list, which was a new list added to the Export Administration Regulations on December 23rd, 2020. In the same session, the US experts will also be sharing on the updates to the Foreign Direct Product Rule and the changes to the Office of Foreign Access Control sanctions that's carried out over the past year. Undeniably, the pandemic has impact to our manufacturing and technology supply chains. In the post-COVID-19 environment, we foresee that there will be increasing attempts among countries to focus on building more resilient supply chains and to diversify their supply chains away from the single market dependencies. E-commerce, e-globalization will also continue to accelerate, transform supply chains, and digitalize the supply networks. So with the greatest digitalization of the market, I think cybersecurity technology control plans will become more central in companies' internal compliance programs. There will be a need for greater integration between compliance and cybersecurity among companies to ensure that the new norm, we can address the threat. As such, we have included this issue in a seminar, and we have experts from various sectors to share how they protect export control related data and R&D information from cybersecurity threats. Earlier this year, the Council of the European Union adopted a regulation to update its legislation on the export controls applicable to sensitive dual-use goods and technologies. These new regulations aim to allow the EU to prevent human rights violations while keeping up with the latest technological developments. It also strengthens controls on the wider range of emerging dual-use technologies and enhance the coordination between member states in support of the effective enforcement of controls throughout the EU. And against this backdrop, we are glad to have regulators from Germany and the Netherlands with us today to share on updates to the export controls related legislations. Joining them in the same session, we will have speakers from Japan and South Korea, two of the largest economies in Asia. Similarly, countries in Southeast Asia continue to make good progress on the strategic trade control regime in their countries. So in this seminar, we have regulators from the Philippines, Malaysia, and Singapore to share the industry on the regulatory changes to their strategic trade controls laws over the past 1 year. Now back to the private sector front, we also have invited representatives from TradeWind, LexisNexis, and Expeditors International to share how they're managing the risks posed to their supply chains, as well as the best practices in relation to their internal compliance program. In the same panel, same session, we have representatives from FTI Consulting, who will share with us on China's new export control law, which took effect on 1st December 2020. China's new export control law is the first comprehensive export control legislation brought by the government of China. It creates a comprehensive and united framework for export control and consists of 5 chapters on various provisions. The panel, the rep from FTI Consulting will share more in this later session. A well-developed trade control policy, I think, is essential to attract high-value foreign direct investments. Coupled with secure supply chains and technology management, that will help us to ensure a robust export control regime. The policies need to be responsive to the rapid evolution in supply chain management and digitalization or globalization of trade. Intangible technology controls in global research and development will continue to be essential. So there's a pressing need to balance academic freedom and research with managing technology transfer. With that, I think we have then representative from Kaido University, Japan, US Patent and Trademark Office, and Celestica Corporation to share their views and experience with regard to intangible technology transfer and intellectual property rights in the research and academic environment. I'm confident that this seminar will allow participants to stay aware of your compliance and disclosure obligations, the latest enforcement trends and priorities, emerging risks, as well as best practices from the commercial sector in terms of the ICP program. Last but not least, I'd like to thank our fellow co-organizers, the US Bureau of Industry and Security, US Export Control and related border security programs, the US Department of Energy, and Japan's Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry for the general support and assistance for this event. Last but not least, wish you all the best. Hope that you have an enlightening and fruitful seminar, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Mr. Lim, for your comprehensive comments, your overview of the event, and for preparing us for what we can expect today and tomorrow. I think it's a great agenda. I'd like to say a special thank you to both you and to Singapore Customs for hosting this event again. It's been a great experience working with your colleagues at Customs, led by Mark Lin and Nellie Chai and Esther N. So we've had a great experience working with them. With respect to the poll, we might not have given them enough time. So for the next poll, which will come soon, we'll try to give the audience a bit more time. So hopefully they'll have a chance to answer. Let me just conclude this session by thanking again all of our opening speakers. I think it was really valuable for us to start this seminar by hearing your words of wisdom, and I believe these opening remarks will orient us and set us on a good path for the event. So that concludes our opening session for the seminar, and next we'll go to our first panel of the event. So our first panel is going to be a deep dive on U.S. export controls, sanctions, and emerging technology. Among other things, we'll receive updates on Burma restrictions, the Foreign Direct Product Rule, the military end user list, the Office of Foreign Asset Control Sanctions, and updates on emerging technologies. This panel is going to be moderated by Michael Burnett, who's the Regional Export Control Officer at the Bureau of Industry and Security at the U.S. Commercial Service Embassy of the United States in Singapore. So I will turn it over to Mike to introduce our panelists and moderate the sessions. And I believe you wanted to start with a poll as well, right, Mike?
Thanks, Dan. I appreciate the intro and covering the agenda. Also want to thank the keynote speakers for their great remarks to start the session. Yes, as Dan said, I'm Michael Burnett. I'm the Regional Export Control Officer for the Bureau of Industry and Security, based in Singapore, but with responsibility for the greater ASEAN region. This is my second year participating in this event, or co-hosting this event, I guess would be appropriate. Last year, I arrived in Singapore. It was my first event I did, and actually I did it from quarantine. So this is a big change over that, and we look forward to next year doing it in person, hopefully. With that, being here for a year, a lot has changed in a year when it comes to U.S. export controls and sanctions. And the focus of this panel, as was alluded to and as the agenda shows, is really to kind of do a deep dive on some of those new regulations and sanctions that specifically affect not just Singapore, but APAC overall. So today we have 4 speakers coming to us, all from DC, all U.S. government experts who are taking their time late in the evening to talk to us this morning about some of those topic areas. We're going to start off with Ms. Tracy Patz, who's going to talk about some of our new export controls, specifically focused on human rights abuses and the response to that, as well as changes to licensing policy for Hong Kong, as well as the situation going on in Burma, Myanmar, and how that affects our licensing policy. She'll be followed by Tom McDonald, who's from our Treasury Department, the Office of Foreign Assets Control, who's going to give a brief review of OFAC sanctions policy, but really go into changes and some case examples affecting the region. He'll be followed by Michael Rittmeyer, who is our licensing officer, who's going to talk about the military end user policy and rule, which is really a new rule which has pretty broad reach here in the region. And it's more than just simply checking a list or looking at technology. It's really doing a deep dive, due diligence wise, before you do business with some entities in the region. And then that'll be followed up and finished off by, backed by popular demand, Dr. Tongali, who is our emerging technology expert from the Bureau of Industry and Security, who's going to give you an update on where we've come in the last 12 months on emerging technology, not just from a US standpoint, but from a multilateral viewpoint. So to your right, or my right, your left, I have a couple questions I've put up as to test your knowledge on US export control. So if you take a second to answer those, I appreciate it, or if you already have, great, and we can review them if there's time at the end of the session. We'll try to get to questions, but with 4 speakers and a lot of material to get through, we might not get to them all in person, but I guarantee you that we will answer them all via written response before the end of that today's session. And without further ado, I'd like to turn over to Ms. Tracy Patz, who's joining us to talk about our first topic. Tracy, over to you.
Thanks, Mike. Good morning and good evening to everybody, and thank you again to Singapore Customs, the Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry of Japan, as well as my own colleagues in the US government for hosting this joint outreach seminar. Now, as many of you know, the United States is a participant in multilateral export control regimes that administer controls to prevent the proliferation of chemical and biological weapons, nuclear weapons, as well as ballistic missiles. But the United States, like many of those nations, also administers what we know as unilateral export controls. This panel will primarily focus on those unilateral export controls, and we will begin with talking about those focused primarily on advanced surveillance, crime control, and human rights. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned before, those unilateral export controls are for items that are subject to the export administration regulations, which are administered by the Bureau of Industry and Security. Those items include not only items in the United States, but items that are abroad of US origin, as well as items that are produced by foreign companies that have US origin technology or have knowledge that they may be used in ways that are contrary to US export controls. So with that in mind, the Export Administration Regulations is a living document. It is updated on a regular basis according to updates by those export control regimes of which the United States is a participant, but also by decisions made by US foreign policy and national security decision makers. Next slide, please. To that effort, we are going to talk a little bit about advanced surveillance emerging technology updates. Now, my colleague, as you heard, Dr. Tangele, will focus on the broader discussion about emerging technology updates as administered by the Bureau of Industry and Security. But I wanted to focus on advanced surveillance in particular because of the impact that it has on human rights. As many of you may be aware, last year, BIS published a notice of inquiry to seek input from the public, including you, as well as other government institutions around the world and any organization that wishes to provide comment about items that could be used in advanced surveillance. Now, many of you are familiar, of course, with biometric systems. Many of you may be using those systems right now in order to access your workplaces. But we do also want to seek your insight, about other equipment, software, and technology that could be used for surveying people. We also included in that notice of inquiry an opportunity for people to comment about items that the public feels no longer warrants control under the Export Administration regulations. So that is one very important avenue by which you can provide comment to the Bureau of Industry and Security about changes that you feel are necessary in relation to not only advanced surveillance items, but any other inquiries that we publish for public comment. As you all may be aware, the United States Department of Commerce does not act alone. We are part of an interagency process. And as such, I would like to point out that the Department of State published an advisory last year about doing business with foreign government end users that may be using advanced surveillance items. Next slide, please. Now, many people may have a question about what we describe as crime control items. A lot of these items are used for lawful purposes by law enforcement personnel, but there are many public reports about how these items can be misused for suppression of civil rights demonstrations, as well as general human rights abuses. So with that in mind, we do update, as I mentioned earlier, the Commerce Control List, the list of items subject to the Export Administration regulations. And one of the ways in which we do this is that we do take into account the reports of abuse of items that perhaps were not on the Commerce Control List previously. For example, on October 6th of last year, we added water cannons to the Crime Control List, primarily because of their misuse against public demonstrations in Hong Kong. In addition, on that same date, we published a policy where we were going to include human rights review as part of the review process of license applications where we may not have used it before. For example, if your company were to send an item such as a thermal camera overseas to a destination that was known for major unrest and for activity to suppress demonstrations or protests, then we might want to advise you in the process of reviewing this application that there was a risk of human rights abuse of the thermal imaging camera in that destination, that there might be a risk of diversion. That's why we included this aspect into the licensing review policy. And As many of you are aware, the US licensing review process does involve other agencies within the US government. So it does receive a 360-degree review of what the aspects of the transaction may entail, meaning who it's being used by, how it's being used by. In addition, I would like to remind the participants that we at BIS are considering changes to Part 744 of the Export Administration Regulations, which governs end user and end use controls, as well as continuing to amend the Commerce Control List. Next slide, please. As many of you have also seen in the news, there is a tool available under the Bureau of Industry and Securities jurisdiction known as the Entity List in section 744.11. That list is used to add entities that are in violation of US foreign policy and national security interests. Since October of 2019 and subsequently to that date, the Bureau of Industry and Security has continued to monitor the situation in Xinjiang, China, regarding the abuses that have been documented of ethnic minorities, including ethnic Uyghurs, Kazakhs, and other ethnic minorities in China. The United States continues to promote human rights and democracy in all aspects of its foreign policy. And because of that, we have added numerous Chinese government entities, as well as commercial institutions that have been publicly defined as participating in surveillance of these ethnic minorities, as well as engaging in forcing these persons into forced labor situations where they are not either compensated appropriately, or more often, they are part of a process that aims to strip these persons of their individual and ethnic identities, including religious aspects of their culture. Next slide, please. The effect of adding these entities to the entity list, as many of you are well aware, is that a license requirement has been placed for all items subject to the Export Administration Regulations, whether they are being exported from the United States, being re-exported from third countries, or transferred in terms of technology. And there is a very limited exception made for those items. We do consider public health and safety when making these additions to the entity list. Next slide, please. To make it clear to you, as well as anyone else in the world who deals in export controlled transactions, we have updated the Xinjiang Business Advisory to include supply chain due diligence, which I understand is an ongoing discussion, which will be held at this very seminar. Next slide, please. As I mentioned, the US government stands for the promotion of human rights and democracy. And we recognize that that democracy in Hong Kong was impaired irrevocably last year. In response to the creation of the National Security Office by the People's Republic of China in Hong Kong, Hong Kong was determined to be insufficiently autonomous under the US Hong Kong Policy Act of 1992. And under Executive Order 13936, following the Secretary of State's report to Congress that Hong Kong was no longer sufficiently autonomous, Hong Kong was relegated under the Export Administration Regulations to the same licensing policy as destinations in mainland China. Everyone should be aware that when exporting or re-exporting items to Hong Kong, there is no separate treatment anymore. You must review the export controls relating to China and apply them accordingly to Hong Kong. As such, at the end of 2020, we removed Hong Kong as a separate destination to make it even clearer. And in July of this year, the Department of Commerce, along with other US government agencies, issued a joint business advisory advising the public about the risks of doing business in Hong Kong. Next slide, please. And as many of you are aware, there's been a considerable change in Burma subsequent to the February 1st coup by the Burmese military and the subsequent dismissal of the elected Burmese government. The Bureau of Industry and Security, in accordance with U.S. foreign policy, made amendments to the export administration regulations relegating Burma to a lower country group tier, meaning that a license requirement was set in place for most items going to Burma, as well as removing any access to what we call license exceptions. If you're doing any business with Burma right now, I strongly suggest that you review the changes that were made on March 8th to be sure that you are not sending items to Burma without a license from the Bureau of Industry and Security if the items are subject to the Export Administration regulations. In addition, we at the Bureau of Industry and Security did list numerous entities in Burma on the entity list as provocateurs of the Burmese military coup. In addition to Burmese government agencies such as the Ministry of Defense and Homeland Security, we also included several state-owned enterprises, including the Myanmar Economic Holdings Limited company, as well as the Myanmar Economic Corporation. And we also included 2 entities as military end users as well on April 9th. And we also did want to ensure that there are consequences for organizations continuing to partner with Burmese military-owned, state-owned enterprises. So we also added mining affiliated companies to the entity list as well. As I said earlier, a license requirement is imposed for all items subject to the Export Administration regulations when those entities are added to the entity list. My colleague, Mr. Rithmeyer, will go into more detail about the various nuances of the military end user and end use rule. Next slide, please. And that concludes my presentation. Hopefully I haven't gone over time, Mike. If there are any questions, I have put down my division's inbox as well as our hotline. Thank you very much, everybody.
Tracy, thanks for that great update. Next to each other in presentations is that even though the authorities are complementary and they both go after some of the same objectives, they are quite different when it comes to how they're implemented and what their effect is. Where obviously the Commerce Entity List is end user based, technology based, a licensing requirement. OFAC sanctions are global reaching on U.S. persons and how their activities as well as the U.S. financial system. So it's always great, and you always get a few questions about OFAC what ifs. So hopefully we can get some of those at the end of the session to pose to you. Next up is another colleague of mine from the U.S. Department of Commerce, Bureau of Industry and Security, is Michael Rithmeyer. Michael's going to talk exclusively about the military end user rules that have come on of late regarding China, Venezuela, Russia, and now Burma, Myanmar as well. So I'd like to turn it over to him to kind of do a deep dive in this new export control restriction to really get into it, because it does have a lot of nuance and a lot of what ifs. So without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Mr. Rithmeyer. Michael?
Hello there. Nice to see some familiar faces again. Mr. Lim, it was good to see you again after we last saw each other in Singapore during the air show. So it's nice to see that you're doing well. Next slide, please. So I'm going to go quickly through this slide because it basically says what I'm going to tell you. Next slide, please. I'll also say right up front that these slides are free to share. I've presented them publicly a number of times, and we have no objection whatsoever. If you would like to share them, feel free. They're publicly available information. They describe the regulations, which are also public. So if I miss a particular topic in the interest of time, You can use these as reference, and I believe some contact information can be available. Also, Mike Burnett has my contact, and I have routinely offered myself up to provide any offline assistance. So the military end use rule was published in April, late April of 2020, as you can see. It became effective June 29th. That was so that we gave industry time to adapt and be prepared. The basic military end user controls have been in place with the Bureau of Industries and Security since roughly 2007. But this regulation change quite drastically expanded the scope of that to add a number of items that we actually listed, and additionally, subsequent to the initial publication, a number of parties that we named. If you go to the next slide. After we published the initial rule, which I'm going to describe a bit more detail later, we realized that we also needed to publish a list of particular parties that were military end users. This was because the original rule had a definition of military end use, which I will cover in a moment, and it also covered a definition of military end user. And the problem is that's a very subjective term. So what we wanted to do was also list parties that we already had agreed were military end users to make life easier for those who are trying to navigate the system. So what the rule does is it establishes first what a military end user is, what a military end use is for the purpose of the regulation, and then it also establishes a list of 102 parties that are listed between Russia and China. We do not have any specific parties in Myanmar and Venezuela. However, the parties we have experienced so far fit within the definition, so we didn't need to list specific parties. Lastly, it does not imply that only the parties on the list are military end users. What it does is name those parties. However, you still have the criterion, and we'll get into that in a couple more slides. Next slide. So what is a military end use? For a military end use, it means exporting an item from the U.S. to China, Russia, Venezuela, or Myanmar, Burma, for incorporation into an item that's either specified on the United States munition list or in one of our list numbers that ends in the letters A018 or in our new 600 series, relatively new. For the purposes of international parties listening to this conversation, you could refer also to the Wassenaar munitions list as a guide. So in other words, if you had items going from the United States to a fighter jet program, a military transport program, a military ship program, those would be items that are listed on the munitions list, either the Wassenaar or the United States munitions list, or items that are under our 600 series. Therefore, you would potentially have a military end use if the item was going to China's weapons development programs. That's the basic way to describe this. What kinds of items are those? Those are items that support any one of the 7 activities listed there on the screen. So if you were exporting items that would be used to produce fighters, so in other words, engine parts for military jet engines, you are going to be using items that would be useful in the repair of aircraft, such as carbon fiber. Those types of items would be what constitute military end use if you were exporting them to China. Don't panic, because there's a lot of caveats. Next slide. Consequently, who is a military end user? Simply put, it's someone who engages in one of the military end uses that's described on the previous slide. So a military end use is clearly the armed services within China, Russia, Venezuela, or Burma, Myanmar, but it's also a person who supports them. And this is where it gets a bit complicated. So for example, in China, the Aviation Industry Corporation of China, we named in the list that I referred to earlier of definitive military end users, we named 8 parties under AVIC. We also named 8 parties under the Aero Engine Company of China, which is the arm that is trying to develop an indigenous aircraft engine capability within China. They are military end users because they are producing items for the PLA. Likewise, in Russia, an example, Irkut, IRKUT, Irkut Aircraft Company produces military aircraft, but they also produce civilian aircraft, as does AVIC. So they're military end users because they support these military programs, but they also support civilian programs, which is what makes this program exceptionally difficult. I can speak to that from personal experience. Okay, next slide. So what are the key issues behind the list? The list basically tells you who has to get a license, as in the military end users, but it also provides a list in a different supplement, supplement number 2 of our part 744 in our regulation. 744 is the end user based controls. 744.21 is the section that refers to military end users. And a supplement number 2 tells you which items are subject to the license requirement. So it's a simple example. Aircraft parts. Those are under the U.S. Commerce ECCN item number 9A991. Aircraft parts. Aircraft parts could be a lot of things, but aircraft parts going to a military end user. So for example, an aircraft company under AVIC, such as Shanghai Aircraft Manufacturing Company, receiving aircraft parts 9A991, does require a license because SAMC is a military end user and it's a 9A991 item, which is an aircraft part. 9A991 is listed in supplement 2. So there you go. It's not as hard as it sounds. It just takes a lot of words to explain it. So the license requirement, there are no license exceptions, meaning that normally in our list, you can use certain exceptions where you do not have to get a license. But for the parties that we listed on the definitive list in supplement number 7, for example, those AVIC parties, the Irkut, several other parties, you cannot use the license exceptions. That's a big restriction. Because what we want to do with the military end user rule, which is the end user list and the end users, is we want to have the visibility into what is going to those parties. The reason for that is so that we know whether, or we can try and assess whether those items are going to military programs, or are they going to support civil programs? Next slide. So how do we review these licenses? If someone submits a license application for a military end user export, what do we do? Well, the short answer is we have this term called presumption of denial. It's a somewhat confusing term. Presumption of denial is not automatic denial. What it is that we start out assuming that the license could be denied. However, if there are reasons to overcome that and approve, we can. This would be different from a policy of denial where we would always deny and there really are no other ways to get approval. So presumption of denial, what does that mean? In a case where we have items going from the US or from Singapore or from another country that would support a civil aircraft program, or would be for one of these parties in China to produce larger components as part of our supply chain. So we send small parts to them, they produce big parts. The big parts come back to us to be built into something in Singapore, the United States, another country. We would overcome potentially that denial because it's not going to a military program, as opposed to an export where we've learned that the item from the United States or Singapore or another country was going to go directly into a Chinese military program, a Russian military program, Venezuela, or Burma. We would deny those. That's where presumption of denial works. One other bit of a subtle caveat is also any item that already requires a license to China, for example, a missile technology item, a nuclear suppliers item, a national security Wassenaar item that requires a license no matter what going to China, we can also evaluate it under this criteria if we think that it's going to support a military end use and we don't have any other basis for denial, we could deny the license to the military end user. Next slide. So when you are considering whether you need to apply for a license based on the military end use, the first thing you need to do is make sure whether or not the item is listed in what I referred to as supplement number 2 to part 744. Effectively, those are items that don't normally require a license to China, but if they're going to a military end user, they do. So you want to make sure the item is correctly classified. And when I use the term classified, I mean assigned to the proper control list number. So as an example, this number on our control list I referred to as 9A991 paragraph D, that covers parts and components that are specially designed for aircraft. Interestingly enough, it does not control aircraft accessories. So for example, if it's something that's not needed in the aircraft to be safe to fly, it's an accessory. So for example, you could argue that seats are not necessary because cargo aircraft don't have seats in the back. But clearly wings are necessary because aircraft do not fly very well without wings. So a wing would be an aircraft part. A seat could potentially be considered an accessory. So that's why you want to make sure that you have the proper classification. Without going too deep, I will say that we help people determine whether the item is controlled or not. The harder one is technology. When do I have technology that's either for development of a particular item or production or use? The reason this one is raised is because oftentimes we have suppliers in China that produce parts. We need to send them the blueprints to produce those parts. Clearly, that's technology. So we have to assess, A, is the party a military end user? B, do I have technology that's described in one of these entries? And C, is it something that we could overcome the presumption of denial? That's the basic 1, 2, 3, A, B, C for the situation. Next slide. This is a bit of a subtle subject, but I want to raise it anyway. Items that go from the US, say, to a third party in Europe or Singapore, for example. So I have a small part that goes from the United States to, I'll use Singapore as an example, since this is who we are discussing this seminar with. You make a larger item that then goes to China. We have this concept called de minimis. What is that? It's really a fancy word that means how much U.S. content is included. if the item that's being produced, say in Singapore, that has US parts in it, if that item, such as, oh, let me use an example, an aircraft engine fan blade for a civil aircraft engine, that item doesn't require a license if it was going from the United States to China. So I don't have to count the US content if it's going from Singapore to China. So therefore, I don't have to get a re-export license. That's the whole point of this slide. I could take another hour to go into the topic of de minimis, but I'm going to keep it at a highlight level. I'm going to repeat that these slides are available for everyone, as is my contact information. If you think you have a situation where an item coming from the United States is going to, say, Singapore, you're going to produce a larger item that might go to a military end user in China, and you're concerned about whether you need a re-export license, feel free to reach out. It will be much easier if I work with you directly. Next slide. So a couple of different key issues that come up regularly, and I've sort of touched on this already. There's two basic types of military end use licenses we see. Some are for hardware that go to China, Russia, Venezuela, or Myanmar, and I'm going to say that most of the licenses I see are going to either China or Russia. We've had a very, very small number that I've seen going to Burma. That would be a total of one, I can say. So we have the hardware licenses. That takes on one situation. Usually those are going to things like an indigenous Chinese civil aircraft program. That doesn't mean it's a denial. It just means it's going to a civil aircraft program. The other type we see are technology, and those can take two forms. It's either for Chinese companies or Russian companies to build parts that then come back to the US. The other scenario is when technology needs to go to China, Russia, to allow them to integrate US components into these civil aircraft. So really we have hardware and technology. Those are the two types of licenses we see most often. Next slide. And I do, by the way, understand this is a very dense, very detailed topic. And I understand I'm giving a very short overview of it. So please, again, I'll say this again, please feel free to reach out through Mike Burnett or through your other contacts, and we will be more than happy to try to go into much greater detail. So these are a few tips if you have someone who feels they need to apply for a license application under the MEU rule. What you want to do is, as you would with any license application, be very clear in what it is you want to do, why you think you need to send the item to China, where does the item fit. Now, I'll recognize these are tailored to U.S. industry, but I know there are a number of companies in Singapore that do business with China that are multinational or that rely on U.S. suppliers to send subcomponents. So I think they still apply. Next slide. A couple of other things, and maybe this is a little bit too domestic, but you don't have to provide purchase orders as a proof that there's a business license. That's really more of a domestic issue, but I will confess that I'm using slides that I've also used for U.S. industry. History is important. So one of the key points of this military end use rule is that most of the items that are impacted by this rule did not require a license directly to China or Russia or Myanmar or Venezuela prior to the implementation of this rule in mid-2020. So I think it's important that we show the history here. If the US company, the Singapore company, whoever they are, have been supplying parts to China for 10, 20 years, now all of a sudden there's a license. I think that's important to note that that relationship has been going on a long time. Everyone is familiar with each other. And therefore, that needs to be taken into consideration before we abruptly change the status of the supply chain. That's the point of the slide. If there are existing supply chains, we don't want to break those. What we want to do with this whole regulatory change is to have visibility, deny when we need to, but more importantly, know where the items are going so that we can be assured they're not advancing the military improvement in China or Russia. Next slide. So I will end this, close to end this, I believe, with a link. It's a bit long, but it takes you to some frequently asked questions, and there are a significant number of those that to some degree help understand this quite complicated rule, but the frequently asked questions are there. I will also circle back to one of my early slides and say the frequently asked questions were part of the initial publication of the rule. We realized quickly that we needed to name the definite military end users. So the frequently asked questions help, but also the list of military end users that we know who they are. We will eventually update that list to add potentially more, maybe take some off. It's hard to say, but there's the list. I can't remember. I believe there might be one more slide. And it sounds like there's not. So now I'll turn it back over to Mike Burnett, and I'll just have a little bit of fun with my colleague Tangeli because I know he loves to hear me talk. So thank you very much, and I'll do my best if there's time at the end to answer any questions.
Michael, thank you for the deep dive on military end users. I know it's we couldn't cover it all today, but it's a very nuanced topic and it's very detailed. So the best advice you gave is the advice that I would echo is that if there are any questions, please reach out to either us at the U.S. Embassy here in Singapore or directly back to BIS headquarters if you have questions before you engage in a transaction that might involve a military end user concern. Next up is our last panelist, but not least, obviously, is Dr. Tangeli, who's our emerging technologies export control guru. Dr. Tangeli is going to talk about what we've done over the last year, along with our multilateral colleagues, to impose export controls on emerging technology, which is really a harder feat than you might expect because by its very nature, emerging technology is new, and it's not like going back and putting controls on military items or putting controls on items that can lend themselves to a WMD program. These technologies are new and they're fluid, and finding the commodities and the technology that support these emerging tech trends is a difficult endeavor. So I don't envy Dr. Tangeli's task, but I'd like to turn over now to Dr. Tangeli. We've got some good questions coming in, so hopefully we can get to them after his presentation. If not, as I said before, we'll definitely answer them all via written response. Dr. Tangeli, over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much. I had a slide for 45 minutes for you, but we will try to just reduce it to a few slides. I want to echo my panelists, the panelists who came before me, by thanking everyone, the organizer, the host, the participant. Thank you for showing up to this seminar, and thank you finally to the panelists. So I will talk about emerging technology. So let's see the next slide. So the issue is, you know, emerging technology are very unpredictable. We don't know where they come from, when they are going to emerge, from where and how. There are just so many factors, social, political, economic factors, incentives, and so that makes emerging technology something very difficult to predict. And another thing is, technology may emerge today, and by tomorrow it's already being used in so many types of applications: medical, electronic, aerospace, medicine, mining, intelligent collection, you name it. The thing is, not all emerging technologies make it past research and development stage, but when they do, they truly affect our lives and the way we do things. So we understand here by emerging technology those recently developed or being developed and not currently controlled, and therefore they are still emerging. Next slide, please. So we cannot deny the goods that come from technology in general and emerging technology in particular. What would we do without technology here, you know, in this time of COVID-19? We can still do seminars, you know, virtually, which is really good. So emerging technology affects all the facets of our lives, the way we communicate, the way we think, the way we live, all that. But we cannot minimize the misuse of technology today. Technology and emerging technology can be used to enhance or produce weapons of mass destruction. They can be used for human rights violations, to control people, and they can become threats to national security of the United States and of the world. Next slide. So there is a need, because of this misuse, there is a need for some form of control. And we are all in this together. Remember this, technology in the hand of terrorists or rogue states are indiscriminately used against anyone that is targeted, including civilians and innocent people around the world. So we must work together to ensure that emerging technology do not fall in wrong hands. The United States is committed to work with our partners and allies, working with and within the multilateral export control regimes for common sense emerging technology controls that do not hinder research, economic growth, and interoperability amongst allies and partners, but do effectively stop or minimize the risk of diversion to unauthorized end users and end use. Next slide, please. So in 2008, Congress enacted the Export Control Reform Act, and Congress gave Commerce, the United States Department of Commerce, the authority to establish appropriate controls on emerging technology as well as foundational technologies. And emerging and foundational technologies will be determined by an interagency process that will consider both public and classified information, as well as information from Emerging Technology Technical Advisory Committee, where I am the designated federal officer, and the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States. Next slide, please. So this is very important. This in identifying emerging and foundational technologies, the process must consider the development of emerging and foundational technologies in foreign countries. Also consider the effect export control may have on the development of such technologies in the United States, and I would add in other countries as well, and the effectiveness of export controls on limiting the proliferation of emerging and foundational technologies in countries of concern. So this is important to distinguish emerging technology from fundamental research, which is not subject to the Export Administration regulations as described in section 734.8 of the Export Administration regulations. Next slide, please. So that same year, in 2018, the United States Bureau of Industry and Security of the United States Department of Commerce published Advanced Notice of Proposed Rulemaking. This is a document where Commerce seeks public comment on the criteria for identifying emerging technologies. And in that document, 14 categories of technologies were established, not for control, but for reviewing for potential emerging technology that warrant further assessment, evaluation, and control for national security reasons. So this document is a document that is publicly available, and I put the reference in the last bullet right there. Next slide, please. So these 14 categories, each one has a subset of many categories. So you have them there. I can just list them quickly: biotechnology, artificial intelligence, position, navigation, and timing technology, microprocessor technology, advanced computing technology, data analytics technology, quantum information and sensing technology, logistics technology, additive manufacturing, robotics, brain computer interfaces, hypersonics, advanced material, and advanced surveillance technologies. And Tracy did refer to advanced surveillance technology in her presentation. Next slide, please. So up to date, this is just to tell you, the Bureau of Industry and Security of the United States Department of Commerce has published 37 emerging technology controls, and mostly in agreement with multilateral export control regimes, particularly the Wassenaar Arrangement and the Australia Group. So many people ask questions, where do I find a list of emerging technologies controls? Where do I find it? There is no separate list where you find them. In export administration regulations, emerging technology controls can be a modification of or a subparagraph to an existing control. And items are listed for control according to numbers. They call export control classification number, and then followed by number lettered numbers, like 1C 350, you know, to designate something, or 2B001, as you are familiar with from the Wassenaar Arrangement. So we are going to review quickly these 37 emerging technology controls that have been published to date by the United States Department of Commerce. Next slide, please. So you can see that the first 5 emerging technology controls were published from what was agreed upon at the 2018 Wassenaar Arrangement meeting. And they were certain micro transistors. Where do you find them? In the export administration regulations under the export control classification number, ECCN 3A001. Continuity of operation software, post-quantum cryptography algorithm, underwater transducer designed to operate as hydrophones, and aircraft specially designed or modified to be air launch platforms. So the ECCN that follow this is where you can find this emerging technology control in the export administration regulations. Next slide, please. So the first 5 slides come from multilateral export control regime. The second set of export of emerging technology controls also come from what was agreed on at the 2019 Wassenaar Arrangement meeting. And they are hybrid additive manufacturing, which can be found in the export control classification number 2B001. And then the computational lithography software, the technology for finishing wafer for 5 nanometer production, forensic tools, software for monitoring and analysis of communication, and suborbital craft. So these 6 emerging technology controls were agreed upon at the 2019 Wassenaar Arrangement, published by Commerce and incorporated into the export administration regulations. Next slide, please. And you have also from the Australia Group, 24 chemical weapons precursors that were adopted, and the single-use biological cultivation chambers with rigid walls These are also published and included in the export administration regulations under this specific ECCM. Next slide. So there is only one unilateral emerging technology control that the US has published. As you can see, the commitment of the United States to work with allies and partners and through multilateral export control regimes to publish emerging technology control. So there is no fear that the United States is going to control all the technology. That's not like that. Next slide, please. So let me quickly conclude here by saying a few things. Number one, emerging technology control is a work in progress. Why? Technology always evolves, as we said. Today, emerging technology become obsolete. Tomorrow, new one emerge. Well, technology categories may evolve. Some will disappear, others will come to life. Emerging technology can only evolve with evolving technologies. So emerging technology control cannot be something done once for all. No, it is something that must be continuously assessed. It's a work in progress. And second, emerging technology is and must be a collaborative and inclusive work with partners and allies, international multilateral export control regime, and also at national level, it's an interagency process. And finally, seminars like this feed into this effort for emerging technology export control. Next slide. With this, I just want to thank you. All this information are publicly available, and you have my contact information. Thank you.
Dr. Tongley, thank you again for joining us here in Singapore for your update on emerging technology. It's always insightful, and also hopefully next year we'll have a specific emerging technology outreach event here in ASEAN to deep dive in person on some of these issues with our partners, allies in the region. Hopefully you can attend that as well. So this comes to the end of our first panel. I do have a couple questions. Thanks for your questions. We got quite a few in that we're answering online, but there's a couple I want to highlight and have a verbal answer to. The first one I'm going to direct to Ms. Pats, Tracy, if you can come on for a second. This question comes up routinely, is there are countries listed in the UN Security Council sanctions or US embargoes that prohibit the exports of arms and related materials to these countries. Does arms and related materials refer to only items on the munitions list, military list, or does it cover dual use items as well? And that's always an interesting topic when it comes to 600 series and stuff. So Tracy, maybe you can answer that question for the.
Sure, Mike. Thanks for directing the question to me. The short answer to the asker's question, who I believe is Stanley Tan, is yes, it does cover dual use items. The point of listing the U.S. arms embargo in country group D5 is to inform the public that license applications for items that are on the Export Administration's Commerce Control List, such as 600 series items, as Mike mentioned, will be reviewed according to the policy of the United States U.S. arms embargo, which are identified in the State Department's International Traffic in Arms regulations. I know that's a little bit cross-referencing regulations, but the Export Administration regulations is pretty long, as everybody on this call knows. So we didn't want to make it any longer than it needed to be by relisting what's already listed in the ITAR. So yes, there are items on the Commerce Control List that are subject to U.S. arms embargo, and you would be wise to review general prohibitions accordingly, as well as the control policies for the 600 series and other items. Thanks, Mike.
Tracy, thanks for the answer. And our last question before we move on to the next panel. Tom, the OFAC rep, always gets a lot of questions, but he'll answer all of them, or if he hasn't already done so in writing. But here's one question for you, Tom. When you talked about Russia, what does Russia mean when it comes to an OFAC EO? I know there's things on the Crimea and other things out there, but when you're referring to Russia, what are you referring to with the regulations? What parts?
Sure. Yeah, and I believe this question was from Marzuki Rahim. When I say OFAC sanctions related to Russia, there are quite a few different things that I mean. So to just briefly run through them, Executive Order 13685 is a comprehensive restriction on US persons from doing business in the Crimea region of Ukraine. That is the only comprehensive sanctions program that we maintain in the Russia-Ukraine space. Beyond that, if there are list-based entities that are named on one of OFAC's lists, I would recommend just checking specifically on what it says when you get a hit on that. So if you see, for example, Executive Order 13661, that is a prohibition generally on business done with that entity, absent an exemption if one exists. If, for example, you see Directive 4 rather than the name of a specific executive order or the letters SDN, that would be what's called our sectoral sanctions programs, which instead of a blanket restriction is a restriction specific to a particular sector. So Directive 4, the one I mentioned, is the energy sector. And there are a few different restrictions. I would point you to that directive specifically, which is available online for more information on that. But yeah, yes, it is a fair question. And there are a few different programs. I hope I've answered that question.
Tom, thanks for your response on that. As usual, always read the fine print when it comes to U.S. Regulations. And if when in doubt, please reach out to the appropriate agency, help desk, or email to clarify the regs before proceeding with a transaction or a purchase. With that, that concludes the first panel. I'd like to thank all our panelists for joining from DC, late night DC, for this panel today. I'd like to turn it back over to Dan.
All right, thanks, Mike. Did we have a poll that we didn't get to? I think you had a quiz, but maybe that already closed out by now.
Yeah, it's kind of OVO now because Tongali answered the question. There's 37 emerging technologies have been placed on the U.S. export control, commerce control list
There it is.
Since inception.
All right, great, thanks. We also had several questions come from the audience on if we will share the slides. I will check with the speakers on that. I know that some are shareable and some are not. So we will make the ones that are shareable available on the registration site. So next up, for our second panel, we're going to look at cyber threats and managing risks to the supply chain. We'll discuss protecting export control data and R&D information, ransomware threats, foreign cloud storage concerns, and reporting considerations for lost or compromised data. The moderator for this session will be Mr. Lam Kwok Yan. He is a professor of computer science at Nanyang Technological University in Singapore. So Mr. Lam, please.
Right, thanks Mike, for the introduction. Okay, first of all, welcome to these panel sessions on cyber threats to export control data and supply chain. Well, as we all know, new cyber technologies have led to shift in cyber threat landscape. And there have been a growing reliance on third-party cloud service provider. And also the recent spate of cyber attacks on supply chain is a clear indication of a worsening cyber threat environment. And there are a lot of challenges in protecting export controlled data and R&D information, such as ransomware threats, and also the growing concern for cloud storage being hosted overseas. So in this session, we have a few distinguished panelists to share their view or experience in this matter. First, we have a few panelists, including Danny Decker. He's from the National Risk Management Center, U.S. Critical Infrastructure and Cybersecurity Agency. He will talk about his view on supply chain management tools for threat against the supply chain. And we also have our second panelist, Mr. Calvin Lee. He's chairman of Harangi Cybersecurity Company. And we'll talk about his view on cybersecurity best practices and common vulnerabilities from a private sector perspective. And last but not least, we have our third panelist, Brad Chapot. He's the assistant legal attaché in the Singapore sub-office to talk about cyber crimes and fraud trends in ASEAN. So without further ado, let me introduce Danny to start his sharing on his view on this topic of supply chain threat. Danny, please.
Professor Lamb, thank you. Thank you. And for the members of the folks that put together the joint industry outreach, thank you for inviting me to be a member of this distinguished panel today. I'm appreciative of Japan's METI and Singapore's customs, the close partnerships that we have with CISA, and appreciate your co-leadership with the U.S. government in organizing the joint industry outreach today. I look forward to speaking with you more about the priorities of the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency and learning from my distinguished colleagues as well. Slide, please. A little bit about the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, or CISA. We're the newest component of the Department of Homeland Security. Our mission is simply to secure federal networks and the critical infrastructure within the nation. I say it simply because it's easier said than done, right? CISA has 3 core competencies. We do risk management really well. We have our partnerships with our international partners, our public-private partnerships, industry, academia, as well as others. And then we also, our 3rd core competency is our technical expertise. We have to be able to provide not only the risk analysis and mitigation, we also need to help explain it at the technical level if we need to for those partners that I just mentioned. I also mentioned our mission earlier, securing the networks that make up our critical infrastructure. That includes the hardware, the software, the services that make up the supply chains for those networks and the critical infrastructure. It's much easier to secure a facility or an installation than it is to secure a network or a critical infrastructure that supports our nation's critical functions. It is much more difficult to secure a supply chain, especially the supply chains that are supporting those critical functions. We have the least control over the supply chain attack pathway simply because it's the most dynamic. It's the most evolving. It's multidimensional. It includes hardware. It includes services. It includes software. We're talking about first-tier suppliers, second-tier suppliers, subcontractors, trusted and untrusted delivery methods. Software assurance, I mentioned software earlier. Software assurance is a part of that supply chain security, and there are many layers per dimension within the supply chain attack pathway. And so identifying those risks and getting at those risks is how we do it to mitigate them. Slide, please. So I work specifically in the National Risk Management Center. There are 6 divisions within CISA, within the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. Inside the National Risk Management Center, we plan and coordinate with multiple organizations, with public and private partnerships, with academia to understand the risks. So we're looking for the threats, we're looking for vulnerabilities, we're looking for consequences, and we're looking for mitigations. And the management of those, the threats, the vulnerabilities, the consequences, and the mitigations make up the management to that risk. We also have a fantastic risk analysis capability within the National Risk Management Center. We take that analysis information and what the risks are, and we share that risk information with our stakeholders, the ones I mentioned earlier, our international partners, industry partners, academic partners, as well as other federal government agencies. And in addition to that, our state and local governments as well. Slide, please. When we studied the risks to information and communications supply chains, we found hundreds, over 200. To better scope how we focus our risk and our understanding of how we do the mitigations, we categorized it down to 9 risk categories. And you can see those here: counterfeit parts, external attacks on operations and capabilities, system development lifecycle processes and tools, inherited risks, legal risks, internal security operations and controls, economic risks, external end-to-end supply chain risks, and then insider threats. Those are the categorized risks that we look at and we look to mitigate when it comes to supply chains within the National Risk Management Center and within the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. Slide, please. So, go back one, please. We might be missing one. Go ahead. So what we did to get at those risks that I just mentioned is we identified the threats, the vulnerabilities, and consequences. We looked at ways to mitigate those risks. The US government is simply an end user of the information and communications technology and not a supplier of the information and communications technology. So we needed the perspective of industry. We put together the ICT SCRIM task force, the Information and Communications Technology Supply Chain Risk Management Task Force, to help us mitigate those risks as a nation. It's made up of about 200 people. Most of them, about 170, are from industry or academic institutions, and the remaining 30 or so are from the federal government. We gave that task force some information sharing protections, and then we broke that task force down into working groups and tiger teams to identify and provide advice to mitigate the risks to our nation's information and communications technology critical infrastructure. The task force has done a lot and continues to do a lot. They identified barriers to information sharing. You don't see that on this slide, but it's something that they've done that we're working with. All governments out there have a problem sharing information amongst each other, whether we're talking about within the government or with partners outside the government. This is nothing new. I'm not telling you anything that's surprising. They're not doing it maliciously or with ill intent. They're just difficult to do at scale. It's difficult to share information at scale. And it's even more difficult to take that shared information, assimilate it, collate it, and turn it into information that decision makers can use to make a decision. So the task force spent a year and took a look at and identified some of the legal barriers, the policy barriers, and the financial barriers to information sharing within the United States. And they made some great recommendations on how our government can break down those barriers. I'll just give you one of the policy examples that we talked about that we're working now to improve, and that's our security standards policy, specific to government acquisitions of information and communications technology, hardware, as well as software to provide us that software assurance. Basically, we're raising the standards, and we're utilizing the new standards of security based on what the task force has identified as some of the problems with the policies that we currently have. We also found that the lexicon or the terms that are used to describe supply chains or vulnerabilities, the consequences, the threats, and the mitigations, it was different. It was different depending on who you were speaking with. If I was talking to an industry member, they would use a completely different taxonomy or lexicon of information than if I was speaking to somebody from the federal government or somebody from one of the state governments or smaller local governments or academia. So to help solve that problem, the task force came up with a common or standard language to utilize with regards to supply chain risks. And that's what the government utilizes now. I'll talk about many of the other things on this slide, but I want to jump to another one that's not on this slide. And that's the task force providing the industry perspective and validation in our responses to presidential executive orders. As many of you are well aware, earlier this year, the president has issued out 3 executive orders that ask us to look specifically at supply chain security, cybersecurity, as well as protecting sensitive data. And so in order to accomplish the tasks, the implied and the specified tasks within those executive orders, we're utilizing the task force as that validation tool to provide the industry perspective that we can't provide within the federal government. I want to see if COVID-19 is on here. Would you mind switching to the next slide, please? It is. Let's go back. I want to talk about one more thing that the task force put together, and that was to take a look at the lessons learned and the best practices from the pandemic. It was a global shock, and in the United States, we saw, and many of you saw this as well, there was a shift in the movement of material and supplies that help us create particularly hardware, like chips and other elements of communications, but we also saw some supply chain impacts with regards to software and the services that are provided in our information and communications technology. Because of that, we wanted to take a look at the lessons learned, and we wanted to share that information with everybody, with all our partners. So we relied on the task force to get gather the information together. We relied on the task force to provide the major players in the information and communications technology space so that they can provide us with their perspectives. We basically wanted to know how their supply chains performed during the pandemic. What lessons did they learn, and which ones broke, which ones didn't break, and why didn't they break? You know, the pandemic provided a lot of negative impact to supply chains. There were some pretty scary moments when some companies needed to take some extraordinary actions to keep their supply chains going. So we captured what those companies did to make that happen and to succeed. And we also took a look at the ones that didn't succeed with regards to supply chain problems and why they didn't succeed. The task force identified 3 mitigation activities for pandemics or natural disasters. The first one was increased need for transparency. In our normal conversations day to day, and I've spoken to many of you about some of these things, we use the term trusted supply chains. In reality, because we're talking about the speed of cyber, because we're talking about such a vast and dynamic array of supply chain providers, and we're not really talking about trusted supply chains as much as we are talking about transparent supply chains. We found that companies that did well during the pandemic, that their supply chains did well during the pandemic, one of the things that was the key for their success was having a transparent supply chain. They knew the security of their second and third tier suppliers and down to fourth and fifth tier suppliers. They knew how secure those supply chains were, so they looked for the weakest link within their supply chains and were able to offset that risk with other methods. We found that companies supported their brand, and companies showed more value as a supplier, as a seller, when they ensured the transparency and the security of their supply chains. It was that simple. The second finding that the COVID-19 task force found was the risk of concentrated suppliers or clusters in technology areas. There's an increased resilience to availability, backing up places to get supplies. Companies suffered due to what we call concentration risk. Too many supplies coming from one company or a certain country or certain regions or clusters of companies. Just-in-time or lean supply chain models are economical. They're great in terms of efficiency, but they also increase risk without a backup plan that can be quickly executed, and without that cluster or concentration of suppliers. The last thing we found was the requirement for senior leadership support for supply chains and for planning for supply chain shock events like a pandemic or a natural disaster. Because of the complexity of supply chains, analyzing our supply chains and understanding the vulnerabilities during a pandemic or a natural disaster leaves you better prepared for when that actually happens. So not only is it important to plan for it, you also need to stress test it. You also need to check your supply chains and see how they're doing under certain scenarios, shock scenarios, to make sure that they perform better when things like a pandemic or a natural disaster really occur. It takes money, that is true, but it also takes C-suite or senior leadership emphasis to make that a success. So those were the findings of the task force with regards to the pandemic or natural disaster. And CISA and the task force have also put together other tools to help companies, to help other governments, to help our international partners reduce the risk to their supply chains. And you can see those on this slide. So we have the SCRIM Essentials document. We found that many US government organizations, particularly the smaller ones, were not able or did not know how to assess their own supply chains in acquisitions or after acquisitions. So we designed a resource that helps explain to organizations how to build supply chain resilience. This tool is becoming popular within the federal government. Other areas within the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency are taking this to the next level and actually building out the programs for some of the smaller organizations that just can't do risk analysis on their own. They did the threat scenarios report. We took a look at some of the threats specific to ICT supply chains, and we identified how the supply chains are attacked. We then shared this information with our partners. We don't have the capability to do this in every organization within the federal government, or some of the smaller companies that are out there don't have the capability to do this or don't have the understanding of how their supply chains can be attacked. So this tool gives them an awareness of how their own supply chains can be attacked. I'll talk about the vendor scrim template, the supply chain risk management template a little bit, which is getting a lot of attention recently. The US government uses a tool called ONSAT. It stands for Outsourcing Network Services Assessment Tool. The ONSAT tool is a tool that the US government can utilize and industry can utilize to assess the supply chain security of the companies that are providing them with tools, with hardware and software. We found the ONSAT tool was a bit too cumbersome. It's about 60 pages long. And we found that many companies that wanted to do business with the US government had to hire full-time employees just to fill out the ONSAT tool, just to tell the government what their supply chain security looked like. The vendor supply chain risk management template is a set of questions that assess the supplier implementation and application of industry standards and best practices to provide clarity for reporting and vetting processes. It's only about 2 pages long, and you don't need to hire full-time staff to fill it out. And it's proving to be a popular because it's short, it's direct, and you don't, like I said, you don't need to hire a full-time staff to fill it out. But it asks the right questions so that smaller companies can self-attest to their supply chain security. I want to make sure I covered everything. And then there are some other items that the task force has come out with that we're putting throughout the US government and sharing with our partners. Another one is the qualified bidder and manufacturer lists. We found that it's easier to reduce your supply chains when you work with companies that have tested and shown you that they have higher level of supply chain security. And once you've attested or determined that they are qualified, they meet those standards, you don't have to keep reassessing them often. You can reduce the amount of time you assess them. And so what we did is we put out a tool that companies can utilize to build their own qualified bidder and manufacturer lists to help them create lists of trusted vendors in their own supply chains. So it's important to understand the slide, please. It's important to understand not only the threats and the vulnerabilities and the consequences that can take place with regards to a supply chain for information and communications technology. What we're doing is creating tools which not only the US government, but other partners, international partners as well, can utilize to help reduce the risk to their supply chains and make it easier to sell their products, provide their products, secure products throughout the world. I am open to questions, or I will hand it back to Professor Lam.
Right. Thanks, Dan, for the excellent presentation. And maybe we can gather all the Q&A at the end. So right now, at this point, I would like to invite Kelvin to share his view on the private sector perspective. Kelvin, over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, and thank you, Dan, and all the other panelists for your sharing so far. It's an honor to be part of this group. So I thought that I would share a bit about sort of observations as a company, working with a variety of customers, including many mid-sized and SMEs, on sort of what are the security challenges that they're facing. And really, as you can tell, it's kind of a lot of these underlying trends are being driven by COVID, right? And we're in now our it's been probably for most of us who are Singapore based, 1.5 years since the onset and this new world of working from home. And I think this has sort of changed like the profile of sort of the most common risks that many of our companies face. So with that, next slide, please. Next slide. Yeah, so just a bit about us. We're a cybersecurity company based in Singapore, focused on the cloud, and serving a variety of customers throughout the region, including most of the large-scale startups here. Next slide. As for myself, I'm the chairman of the company, and before this had spent time at Grab, Palantir, as well as GIC. Next slide. So the first thing that I want to talk about is sort of like the challenge of working from home, right? Which was, prior to COVID, a relatively small risk, right? Because for most of us, for most of our organizations, it was something where a small percentage of our workforce of our team might be working from home at any point in time, versus now where it's essentially become the default, right? And this has massively, sort of, while the risks are similar, because the risk profile is so much bigger, kind of attackers have naturally sort of followed suit, right? And there was a massive increase in malware, over 350% in 2020 as hackers started to take advantage of this. Next slide. Yeah. And so a lot of this relies on phishing, and in a work from home environment, kind of the probability that your employees or that you yourself fall for some of these phishing attacks is increased. Next slide. This includes sort of not just sort of conventional attacks, that people have historically done that are email based, but as we've evolved to use new mediums of communication, such as Zoom, WebEx, more and more attacks have been happening actually at the level of those services too. So it's not just the sort of like kind of as we've adapted our work habits, so to have the attackers, right, adapting sort of their techniques and what part of the attack surface area that they've been going after. Next, please. And part of the challenge, and really part of the reason why some of these phishing attacks have been most successful, is that back in the office, it was easy for you, if you received a potentially malicious mail or an email that looked sort of weird, physically walking over or turning to the person to verify that is the that's real, was sort of pretty commonplace, right? There's a closer sort of shared understanding of what our colleagues are like, what their patterns are. In this new COVID-19 sort of world, many of us we may never have seen some of our new colleagues in person, right? So being remote, this sort of verification isn't really an option anymore. And of course, attackers exploit this, right? And given especially for spear phishing attacks that are more targeted. They can create a sense of urgency within the email to cause kind of the user to react fast, right? And really the bottom line is that when you're working from home, kind of isolated from your team, at least in person, the odds swing somewhat in the attacker's favor. Next slide, please. The other thing, is that rapid cloud adoption, which has been necessary for most organizations to cope with this sudden surge in working from home, right? There was no way anyone had sort of like who was sort of running on a premise had the spare capacity to cope with this sort of immense surge. But at the same time, right, the cloud poses a different set of cybersecurity risks, right? One that, kind of traditional cybersecurity tools that are built for an on-premise environment don't necessarily address. Not that it's more dangerous, like in fact, many ways, for most organizations who don't have the scale to sort of manage their own data centers, you're actually, from a security point of view, far better off using the cloud. But there are still things that are specific to the nature of cloud security that you have to take care of, right? And so the rapid adoption of this has also increased the surface area of this risk. The number of businesses with at least half of their IT workloads in the cloud is expected to double to 56% this year. The overall cloud computing market is growing at a very rapid clip, and even faster here in Asia. Next slide, please. And so, there are more and more unsecured endpoints and more cloud apps being used, and at the same time, sort of more and more of this cloud infrastructure being subject to attack, right? And so, what are some of the things that your organization can do in practical terms? Next. So the first is, really the fundamentals that, that probably should have been in place even before COVID, right? Which is just strong baseline cybersecurity awareness, and taking into account sort of like the latest developments because of COVID to implement additional security policies, right? So things like, adopting phishing simulations to make sure that your employees kind of understand both, kind of what some of these attacks might look like, but also to kind of reinforce the importance of why, they should pay attention during the phishing, the counter phishing training versus sort of just, clicking through it as yet another compliance requirement. Helping them understand why their home network security has to be set up in a better place, right? So simple things like turning on encryption keys, right? Turning on Web 2 or 3, WPA 2 or 3, kind of on your home Wi-Fi. Making sure you've changed default passwords on routers, right? Things that you don't really take into account when you're coming into the office every day, right? Because at the office, like IT is managing like the networks, things are in a good shape. But at home, some of this ends up being sort of a personal responsibility, right? So equipping your employees with the knowledge and the tools to be able to do that is important. Adopting sort of like a zero trust model, given that you can't really rely on sort of a network being reliable once it's crossing over at home, and then frequently conducting security reviews. Next, please.
Calvin, will you be able to wrap up in the next 2 minutes so that we can stick to the schedule?
Sure. It's also important to not forget about workers who are out of sight. And I think a lot of companies have been using remote desktops quite successfully here. Next. And then adopting data loss prevention in the cloud, right? To make sure that sort of cloud doesn't end up being a vector by which data gets exfiltrated. Next. And then, very, very critically monitoring threats to your VPN, right? It's the most used and often most abused tool in the work from home setup, right? So it's important to monitor threats to your VPN. Next. Really sort of like the bottom line with all of this is that, kind of cloud security has gone from something that's a nice to have to something that's essential kind of in this brave new world. So with that, I'll wrap up. Thank you.
Right. Okay. Thanks for helping to keep up with the time. So we'll have our next panelist to share his experience. I would like to pass the time to Brett to talk about cyber fraud in ASEAN. Brett.
Professor Lam, thank you very much. Can I just get a quick audio check from Daniel? I had to do a quick device change here at the last minute.
Yeah, no problem.
Okay. All right. So again, my name is Brett Chabot. I am an FBI agent. I'm an FBI agent who's assigned to the U.S. Embassy here in Singapore. And a lot of what we cover in this office is cyber-enabled fraud that we see throughout Southeast Asia. To the extent that we get involved at my office or through the embassy in Singapore is where there's some sort of connection to Singapore. Usually that is through their financial industry, their banking system. So what we see, and I'll cover the three frauds we see a lot, and I'll go into a little bit more detail on the BEC frauds here in a second. So that in short stands for business email compromise, which is a little bit of a bulky name. And I'll explain a little bit more about what that is in a second. And that's probably a good 90% of the frauds that we see that come through our office. In addition to that, we see impersonation scams, which I don't think will affect too many people in this office, but it's just one thing I wanted to cover because I can say, at least from U.S. law enforcement agencies, whether it's the FBI, the DEA, IRS, DHS, we will never call anybody and demand money for the forgiveness of an arrest warrant. That it might sound silly, but that just doesn't happen. We don't do that, but unfortunately, we see a lot of victims who fall prey to that. Sometimes it's not always U.S. law enforcement. It could be law enforcement from other countries, but I think it's safe to assume that that is not a way that law enforcement normally conducts business. And a general rule of thumb to go by, and it also falls under the romance scams, which you see next, is just never to send any money to anybody who's calling you on the phone, ever. There's no reason you should ever do it. And so that's where, unfortunately, we see a lot of the impersonation scams where we have folks who are sending money to some bank account somewhere because they've been told they have an arrest warrant. We also have the romance scams where somebody's communicating via social media platforms with an unknown perpetrator, and over the course of months, a lot of times these are long, detailed scams that play out, and generally after a while, the perpetrator starts asking for money, and then the individual will start to send money, and we've seen probably about $1 million in losses just in transactions through Singapore financial accounts. Singapore bank financial institutions over the last year. The big one that I want to touch on is BEC, also known as business email compromise scams. And in short, this is a significant type of fraud that covers all sorts of companies, large, small, and everywhere in between. And over the last year, we've seen roughly $60 million in frauds perpetrated by $60 million that have gone just through Singapore, because again, that's where my office gets involved, is if it's specifically transiting through Singapore. So I know we have a broad audience here that includes more than just Singapore. So keep in mind that that 60 million is just Singapore. When you look at the rest of Southeast Asia and Asia at large, it's going to be quite larger than that. And as far as the scam is, how that scam works, I'll get into it here. If we could go to the next slide, please. So as I had mentioned, this is a kind of a bulky name, business email compromise. And this is a public service announcement that you can see here, dated September 10 of 2019, issued by the FBI. And at the time, we had looked at frauds that were reported through the FBI's IC3, which is their Internet Crime Complaint Center. And the total amount of alleged losses was $26 billion. So that's over 6 years, $26 billion. And essentially, what a business email compromise scam is, it might be kind of hard to read on the slides, but where that arrow is going on your slide, and I'll read it out loud for the group. The scam is frequently carried out when a subject compromises legitimate business or personal email accounts through social engineering or computer intrusion to conduct unauthorized transfers of funds. Now, generally, so it's a compromise of your business email is essentially what it is, hence the name. However, what we normally see is it references two potential types in here, social engineering or computer intrusion. Most of what we see, and I would wager a guess, somewhere between 80 and 90% of the ones that we see are actually through social engineering and not some form of computer intrusion. Of course, an intrusion would be some sort of nefarious actor, being able to intrude into your computer network and access your email account and maybe other systems without your knowledge. Where the social engineering comes in, and again, this is by and large how most BEC frauds are perpetrated, is through open source social media, LinkedIn, not to mention several others, where the perpetrators are spending lots of time on research in advance to identify their targets, to figure out who their targets communicate with, what their role might be in it at their business. After months of targeting, they figure out how to target you. And we'll get into an example in a second of how they use the social engineering to start communicating with you as though the bad guy is actually one of your vendors or suppliers. So just one last comment on this. So we're looking at about, like I said, 26 billion in losses over a 6-month period. In Singapore, just over the last year, we've seen 57 million come through Singapore financial institutions. And just to kind of hit home on this, believe it or not, this morning I just was emailed through our Internet Crime Complaint Center through the FBI back at FBI headquarters of a $500,000 wire transfer sent from a large U.S. company that was duped via this very fraud. This just happened this morning, and it was again through the social engineering, where suddenly the company thought that they were communicating with a vendor. They actually weren't. They were communicating with a bad guy, a perpetrator, who was able then to adjust the wire instructions and allow the company to send what the company believed was an actual payment for an invoice, but they were now routing it instead of to the company, but to the perpetrator. In this case, it was a $500,000 wire. We get about 2 of these per week just in Singapore. Next slide, please. So how is this done? If you would take a look at these two, using my name, these 2 emails, and you can kind of get an understanding of how how a bad guy or a perpetrator could start communicating with somebody who's in control of accounts payable, payment of invoices at a supplier or at a company. And they may be looking at communications with one of their vendors, right? So through social engineering, the perpetrators are able to identify business email accounts associated with people who may be involved in approving or in sending wire transfers, right? So here I've highlighted 2 specific examples of how they've essentially changed the email address. In this case, this would be the email of the vendor who's supposed to receive payment for the invoice. It looks pretty much the same. I've highlighted these 2. I think we've now had the slide up for maybe 20 seconds. Most of you have probably picked up on one, if not both of these, but this is because we've highlighted this. I've told you that these email addresses are different and you need to look for something. Now imagine, especially in the pandemic days, we all get bombarded by whatever 150 200 emails a day, if not more, and you're not going to be specifically reviewing every single email address down to the dotted i's and crossed t's to make sure that you're actually communicating with the right person. It's just not human nature to inspect every single email that closely. So humans are prone to error, right? And this is a very close, these are subtle changes in email addresses that allow the perpetrator to communicate direct with accounts payable, change wiring instructions, and then make the company, who is now a victim, wire transfer, in many cases, millions of dollars to a perpetrator. And unfortunately, and we'll cover what to do if this ever happens to your company here on the next slide, but in short, in the days of wire transactions where you're dealing with perpetrators on the back end, they're smart. They know what they're doing. They're going to move the money out as soon as they possibly can. So unless this is flagged immediately, chances are the money's gone. We have had some instances where we've been able to freeze the accounts before the money was sent, to another jurisdiction, but unfortunately that doesn't happen quite as often. So here, if you haven't been able to tell, it's just a slight change between the B and the D. So it's the B for Bravo, D for Delta, in my last name on the top. Example there, and then the bottom is just, and this is one we actually see routinely because you have R and N, when you put them together they look just like an M, right? And so we see the perpetrators do that quite a bit. So where it says my business versus RN business, again, if I hadn't flagged this for you, I bet you many of the folks on this call would not have caught it. They would have been dealing direct with now a perpetrator and not a supplier who's expecting payment on an invoice. Next slide, please. So who are the victims? We had talked about the impersonation scams, the romance scams. By and large, those two types of scams affect individuals who maybe aren't quite as tech savvy. However, the business email compromise scams affect businesses of all sizes. We're talking about Fortune 500 companies. We're talking about small, medium-sized companies. We're talking about large universities in the United States, endowment funds. The victims are all of all sizes, and many times the perpetrators seize on larger companies because there's less communication, because there's more segregation of duties, there's more departments, and it's not payment of invoices isn't held to a strict few. So there's sometimes things are lost in communication, and a lot of times that can work to the perpetrator's advantage. Whereas if you have a company of 10 people and the accounts payable person sits outside the CFO's office, a lot of times they'll detect that. So again, generally how this happens is you have, through that kind of fake email, and in the example we showed you on the previous slide, the companies now believe they're interacting with a supplier when in fact they're interacting with a bad guy. What comes next after that, in order for the perpetrator to actually benefit from this scheme, is they need to change their routing instructions. And that sounds silly, but it happens quite a bit, which is the perpetrator is now going to communicate via email and tell the victim that, oh, by the way, we just changed our bank account. Here's our new bank account. Here's our new our new routing number, bank account number, beneficiary name. And of course, all of that, the beneficiary name especially, is going to closely align with who the victim company is. But that's essentially how the perpetrator has gone from using social engineering to providing new wiring instructions, and then ultimately to the end game, getting their wiring instructions into the hand of the victim, who is now then wire transferring, in many cases, millions of dollars to a perpetrator.
Brett, can you wrap up in 1 minute so that we can ask you some questions? Thanks.
Yeah, I got just one slide left. So long story short is, if we could go to the next slide, please. How to protect yourself. So if you look at the bullet point highlighted in red there, this is really the key way to try to protect yourself. And that is to add internal controls to identify and scrutinize changes in vendor payments. In other words, if there's one takeaway that you guys remember from this presentation, it is that never change wiring instructions for a vendor over email. I would just, at some companies, it might be hard to do that depending on your size. I would personally never do it via email. I would always confirm those via phone, and I would never do that with a phone number that's been changed via email. I would always go back to your original vendor profile, contact those who were in charge of setting up the vendor profile, and try to figure out what the wiring instructions are and if any changes had been submitted over the last month. So with that said, I'll wrap up here, turn it over to questions. Thank you, Professor Lamb. Stand by for questions.
Thank you, Brett. Let's start with some our Q&A sessions. I actually have some questions that I would like to ask our first panelist, Dan. Dan, could you share with us what is driving you, or what has been driving you to make ICT supply chain risk management a priority?
Sure. There's two answers to that. The first one is it's been around and it's been an emphasis area for years. The ICT SCRIM task force, the Information and Communications Technology Supply Chain Risk Management Task Force, has been operating for about 2 years, 2.5 years now. Yeah, 2.5 years now. So, and they recognized the supply chain risks back then when we presented them with what are some of the problems you're seeing in industry that the government needs to help solve sooner rather than later. And so they brought forth the concern about supply chain risks. Fast forward that to today, and you see part of the problem is, or excuse me, part of this, the president has issued executive orders, that 3 of them this year alone, that specifically take a look at supply chains and how we're securing supply chains, whether it's to the federal government, whether it's to the national critical functions, the critical infrastructure that I talked about in my remarks. So the emphasis is there, and the emphasis has been there previously. It's one of those threat vectors that no one wanted to talk about because they just didn't see it as a problem. It's not very understood, at least it wasn't several years ago, very understood. And the consequences of a supply chain attack were not understood because no one was held accountable. We didn't look to the nth degree at software assurance to determine whether it was secured or not. We assumed that the prime vendor selling it to the government had ensured its security. And then we found out afterwards it wasn't.
Okay. Well, before I invite, I have my question for the next panelist from the industry. But before I do that, I would like to ask one more question. So,
please,
what, from your view, how can the industry best support this objective of supply chain risk management?
There are 2 ways I'll talk about to answer that. The first one is the ICT SCRIM task force. I know I go back to this a lot. Is a unique capability within CISA, and it provides a perspective that we just don't have anywhere else with regards to supply chain security within the federal government. So I would ask that I will put the link to that site on the chat in a moment. Please go to that site, take a look at the products, provide feedback on those products. You can email the site and provide feedback on those products if you find them useful. If you don't, that's the first way you can help. The second way you can help, if you want, join the task force. The task force does a fantastic job of making recommendations or considerations for the U.S. government to solve the nation's biggest supply chain risks within information and communications technology. So the first big help is utilize the products and tell us what you think and how we can make them better. And then the second thing is, if you want, join the task force. I will put out that the CISA is created, or had created in August, the Joint Cyber Defense Collaborative. The Joint Cyber Defense Collaborative will lead development of U.S. cyber defense plans by working across the public and private sectors to help defend against cyber threats to critical infrastructure. And I don't know, they haven't formulated yet how they're going to reach out to those public and private sectors, but becoming a member of those private and public sectors will be a good thing in terms of being able to make inputs that help the Joint Cyber Defense Collaborative create those plans.
Okay, great. We have 5 minutes left, so I would like to use these 5 minutes to have 2 questions. The first question is to Calvin from the industry perspective. From your point of view, how has the use of the cloud changed the nature of the security challenges faced by organizations?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I think a lot of it has to do with, you know, that the cloud is not fundamentally any less secure than running it on-prem, right? So like on-prem, if you think about it, you're responsible for every layer from, you know, the physical hardware, the physical access to the data center, the operating system that's running on your hardware, the virtual machine, the container, you know, all of that is your responsibility, right? And so, like, unless you have massive scale, like, it's very hard to invest the level of resources you need to build the capabilities to really secure that well. In the cloud, you know, the scaled cloud players like AWS, Azure, GCP, they're taking care of most of that stuff, right? So if you use like a database as a service or some storage, like S3, a storage service, you're not thinking about, okay, well, when was the last time that I patched the, you know, OS that this machine runs on, right? But everything from that layer that's under your own control in terms of the API, the settings and the configurations at the, say, the cloud providers layer, you're still responsible for that. The thing that makes it tricky is that you like all of the major cloud providers offer so many more services, right? So, you know, just AWS alone, you know, several hundred different services, all who have their own settings and like quirks. You then multiply that by, you know, all of the developers that you have in your organization who have the ability to spin up and down, you know, any number of instances of these services. And the complexity of the problem just explodes, right? So it's very hard to secure it well without sort of, you know, and it's not possible to do it just by process discipline, right? Because the scale is just so large, and all these changes are happening like in real time. And so I think we're going into an era where you really need specialized kind of cloud security software for the purposes of managing it. You know, kind of otherwise you'll the complexity explodes.
Right, great. Thanks for sharing your view with our audience. And I have the last questions for Brett. Would like to ask your advice for our audience. That is, what shall they do if they become a victim of the BEC?
And thanks, Professor Lamb, for the question. In short, if you do become victimized by this, there's a couple of things you can do. Number one, I would reach out to your financial institution first and request them to contact the receiving financial institution, so you have the two banks talking to each other. There's something that can be requested, which is called the SWIFT recall notice. Many of you are probably familiar with it, and that is a recall notice from bank to bank. So at this point, you're not even involving law enforcement. You're going direct between the two remitters and beneficiaries of the wire itself. If the money has not been moved yet out of the receiving account, there's a good chance the banks will be able to proceed accordingly and either stop the money before it comes in or put a freeze on the account in case the money's in the new account, but it has not been transmitted out onward to other destinations. The second thing I would do would be, of course, to contact law enforcement. There's many different ways you could do this. Obviously, whatever country you reside in or your company's headquartered in, I would contact the national law enforcement or police agency there to inform them. Another option you can do in addition to that would be to file a complaint on the IC3.gov website. So that is www.ic3.gov, and that is predominantly an FBI database. However, we can use that and the information that's pumped into there to then work with our host nation counterparts in whatever country we're assigned. So for me specifically, I work with Singapore Police Force on a daily basis regarding all types of scams, of course, many of which are BEC as we discussed. Singapore Police are fantastic partners in this, and they can work. They can use their own law enforcement authorities in addition to the banks talking to themselves to increase chances of a potential recovery.
Right, thanks. Okay, our time is up, and I would like to take this opportunity to thank all our great panelists for sharing their professional view and experiences with our audience. Once again, thank you very much, and hope everyone enjoyed this session and have some takeaway from here. I'll pass the time back to Daniel. Over to you.
Thank you, Mr. Lam, for that great moderation of that panel, and thank you, panel 2, for the great discussion. Brett, I liked your one takeaway concept, and I will remember to never wire or change payment instructions over email. I remember getting many of those same warnings when taking out a mortgage. And I also wanted to thank Kevin for getting us back on track with the time. And I'm sorry that your presentation got cut short, but we can make your full presentation available to the participants if you agree. And in fact, we got some additional questions coming in if we could share the slides, which I previously mentioned on the previous panel. We will make those presentations that are shareable available on the registration site. Some of them are not shareable, but many of them are. Okay, let's move on to the final panel now. And according to the survey at the beginning, this is the panel that has the greatest interest. So we'll end with a high point. This panel is on developments in strategic trade regulations and controls. And the panelists will update us on regulatory changes in their respective national strategic trade laws. And the moderator for this session will be Ms. Lim Sok Pung, who is the head of the Trade Strategy and Security Branch at Singapore Customs. So Ms. Lim, please join us and moderate this panel.
Hey, thank you, Dan. Just do an audio check. Can everybody hear me?
You sound great.
Okay, thanks, Dan. So good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all. I'll be moderating today's final panel session on developments in strategic trade regulations and controls. So we have 4 presentations for this panel session. First up, we will have Mr. Eisuke Araki, Director from the Office of International Affairs for Security Export Control at the Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry of Japan. Mr. Araki will be sharing an update on Japan's export controls. So following Mr. Eisuke's presentation, we will have Mr. George Peach, Director General of BAFA, Germany. Mr. Peach will be sharing with us on the new EU regulation that was recently published. So next, we will have Ms. Gustav Wieser, Customs Attaché from the Embassy of the Kingdom of the Netherlands, and Ms. Karina Bottomer, Customs Officer at Central Import and Export Office at the Customs Administration of the Netherlands. Ms. Wieser and Ms. Bottomer will be sharing with us on the development of the guidance and internal compliance program for the academia and research institutions. And last but not least, we have Ms. Miyeon Kim, Deputy Director of South Korea Trade Control Policy. Ms. Miyeon will be sharing with us on export licensing procedures in the Republic of Korea. So now we'll have Mr. Araki to share with us on Japan's update. Mr. Araki, please.
Thank you for your introduction. Good morning, everyone. I'm Eisuke Araki. Currently, I'm working as a director to the Office of International Affairs for Security Export Control of METI in Japan. First of all, I'd like to express my sincere appreciation for the efforts of the Singapore Customs, the U.S. Department of State, the Department of Commerce, and the Department of Energy in organizing this seminar. This is my 3rd participation in this seminar, and I'm happy to see the program of this seminar enhanced and more countries participating each year. In this presentation, I will introduce the recent development of Japan's strategic trade management. There are 3 topics: outreach to academia, regulatory update on ITT control, and the update of foreign end user lists. First, the outreach efforts to academia. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. I made a presentation on the topic of outreach to academia last year, but as this is an important challenge, I'd like to touch on this theme again. This slide shows the overview of all government actions. The updated data is highlighted in red. There are 2 pillars in our outreach program to academia: actions to raise awareness and the programs to support the effort of each university for strengthening in internal compliance. Orange box shows the first pillar and the green box shows the second pillar. Guideline for the control of sensitive technology was published in 2017 and was notified to universities which have the relevant faculties relating to the export control areas by the government. Furthermore, we launched an e-learning homepage to provide the important information, such as the need for security export control, outline of the export control system, and the activities to be paid more attention for the academia. The guideline and e-learning site are both available in English. I'd like to explain more about this guideline in the next slide. Next slide, please. The guidance was first introduced in 2008 and was modified drastically in October 2017. The updated guidance consists of 3 key elements. First, we identified the typical examples of critical research areas of academic activities. You can see them in orange boxes. In this regard, it showed several scenarios where technological leakage could occur, such as through foreign students and participation in international joint research activities. We also selected 55 critical research areas, such as nuclear engineering and aerospace engineering, that have a relatively high degree of significance in terms of ITT control. The purpose of publishing these pieces of information was to remind the existing risks associated in academic activities. Second, we provide role models regarding control methodology. You can see them in green boxes. In this context, METI recommend a top-down approach and provide methodology for academia to establish appropriate management system. We also provided responsibility sharing model between professors and administrative division of each university. Third, purple boxes, we provide a set of sample documents which could be used in internal compliance in academia. METI recommends then to introduce, for example, simple check and review sheets, which can be filled with yes or no answers. This new guidance is an important outreach tool to raise academia's awareness in Japan. In addition, the government holds explanatory events every year to disseminate the guideline to universities in Japan. Next slide, please. Next, the program to strengthen universities' self-management. There are 3 programs as shown in the green box. Among these 3 programs, the expert dispatch program is the most effective one. Upon request from universities, METI dispatches experts to support their own initiative to develop internal compliance. Those experts are mainly selected from retired people with a long experience of export control management at major companies. The government registers these experts and dispatches them to universities which are willing to hire these experts. On-site consultation is conducted by a special team in METI. It aims to support the university's efforts to introduce internal compliance. In this program, we target universities which had trouble or showed little response against the government actions. The intent of this consultation is to bottom up the overall level of university's implementation. With regard to the establishment of regional networks, METI encourages universities to organize regional networks on security export control. Next slide, please. In Japan, there are 8 major administrative divisions, and each administrative division has a branch office of METI. These branch offices promote regional networks of universities on security export control. Currently, there are 13 regional networks in 8 regions, and about 180 universities are involved. According to the government survey, a total number of universities which have relevant faculties to the export control is about 300 in Japan. So more than half of those universities belongs to one of these regional networks. The advantage of establishing these networks is to help information sharing among the group members. And this network also serves as a point of contact to METI. The network supports the efforts by the government and provides an opportunity to share information or exchange views between the government and the universities. The number of the regional network is still increasing, and it contributes to raising the level of universities' self-management of export control. Next slide, please. This slide shows the ratio of universities with export control divisions and ICP. The ratio of universities with ICP and divisions responsible for export control is going up in the past 3 years. In particular, all national universities have introduced ICP and divisions responsible for export control by 2020. The ratio of universities other than national universities, such as private, prefectural, and municipal universities, with ICP and divisions responsible for security export control has also increased, but they are still in the development stage. These are the update of outreach activity to academia in Japan. Next slide, please. Next is a regulatory update on ITT control in Japan. Next slide, please. The regulation related to technology transfer control in Japan is under the process of updating. The current export control rules capture the technology transfer from residents to non-residents. Technology can be transferred from residents in Japan to non-residents in other countries, but it could also be transferred from residents in Japan to non-residents in Japan. Classification of residents or non-residents is mainly decided by the successive period of time of their residing in Japan. All foreigners who come to Japan are non-resident at first. However, if they reside in Japan for more than 6 months, they are treated as residents without any application process. Therefore, foreign students or researchers are outside the scope of the export control rules after they reside in Japan for 6 months, especially in case in this slide. Next slide, please. This slide describes the update of the rule. we intend to introduce a new classification of residents in which residents are regarded as non-residents in certain cases. As I explained, the current regulation in Japan captures technology transfer from residents to non-residents. Universities that are to accept foreign students, researchers, or professors from abroad are required to get a license to transfer the control technology to them at first, because they are non-residents. However, if they resided in Japan for more than 6 months, those universities are no longer required to get the technology transfer license, since the status of those foreigners becomes residents. After they are treated as residents, only the transfer of control technology to other non-residents is controlled. However, if foreign students, researchers, or professors intend to transfer technology, they would do so after they go back to their own countries. And as you can imagine, it is usually difficult to check whether they comply with the Japanese law or not after they return to their countries. Given the situation, we are going to strengthen the conditions of the classification rule on residents. If those residents are classified as significantly influenced by foreign countries, those residents will be treated as non-residents. For example, foreign researchers or professors who actually have strong connection with the foreign government or foreign universities through employment contract or sponsorship contract will be treated as non-residents, even if they are residing in Japan for more than 6 months. This is the update on ITT control in Japan. Next slide, please. The last part of my presentation is the foreign end user list in Japan. Next slide, please. The government of Japan publishes the foreign end user list as reference information of the catch-all control. The list has been updated usually once a year. The latest version was issued on 17th September with 600 entities in 14 countries. This list is neither the embargo list nor sanction list itself. The aim of the foreign end user list is to supplement exporters' self-management of strategic trade control, especially the catch-all mechanism. If exporters in Japan find that their end user is included in this list, they are usually required to consult with the government. Next slide, please. That concludes my presentation, and I'd like to welcome questions after all the other speakers' presentations. I'm also happy to receive questions by email. My address is shown in the bottom of this page. Thank you very much for your patience.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Araki, for has conducted to the academia. I believe it's a lot of hard work. It's also interesting to note Japan's regulatory update on ITT control and end user list. So if there are any questions from the audience, as with the try to address them either through the Q&A chat box or after all the presentations from this panel. So I will now turn over to Mr. Peach for his presentation. Mr. Peach, please.
Yes, hello, good morning. I hope you can hear and see me. My name is George Peach, and I'm speaking on behalf of the German Federal Office for Economic Affairs and Export Control, BAFA, where I'm responsible as Director General for Legal and Procedural Questions. First of all, I want to thank Singapore Customs and the United States Bureau of Industry and Security and Export Control and Border-Related Security Program and Department of Energy and Japan's Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry for giving BAFA the chance to present an overview of the latest developments in strategic trade controls. I'm glad to have the opportunity to participate in this seminar via WebEx. I also hope that after this pandemic, we will have the opportunity to meet again in person in the near future. Let me introduce to you BAFA with a couple of words. The Federal Office of Economics and Export Controls, abbreviated BAFA, is a central licensing authority in Germany, and it is responsible for the administrative implementation of the federal government's export control policy. BAFA is a single point of contact for applicants of export licenses for both conventional armaments and dual-use items. Today, as a contribution to the panel discussion about developments in strategic trade regulations and controls, I would like to highlight the recent developments in the European export control system. Next slide, please. This slide shows you the modernization process of the EU dual-use regulation. The export control system in Germany is based on national legislation and harmonized European regulations. In both cases, the starting point is a principle of freedom of foreign trade. This means all exports are free, provided that no prohibitions or restrictions apply. As you probably all know, the strategic trade with dual-use items has been subject to a European regulation since 1995. The Council Regulation 428 from 2009 was substantially amended several times. Since further amendments needed to be made, the Commission proposed in 2013 that the regulation should be recast in the interest of clarity, effectiveness, and efficiency. In September 2016, the Commission submitted to the European Parliament and the Council a proposal for a regulation setting up a new EU regime for the control of exports, brokering, technical assistance, transit, and transfer of dual-use items. The revision of the dual-use regulation was initiated by the European Commission in 2016 in view of the experiences of the Arab Spring, in the course of which the use of telecommunication surveillance equipment by authorities led to the monitoring of social networks and subsequently to massive human rights violations. The new dual-use regulation was intended as a reaction to this. In July 2020, Germany assumed the presidency of the Council of the EU, and after a long period of discussions, an agreement was reached in May 2021. The EU institutions finally agreed upon and finalized the text of the new regulation, now called 821, which came into force on the 9th September of 2021. What are the main changes? Pursuant to Article 3 of the old and new dual-use regulation, authorization is required for the export of dual-use items listed in Annex 1 of the regulation. Annex 1 only includes items that are listed under one of the 4 international non-proliferation export control regimes. This is nothing new. What also hasn't changed, the current regulation 8428 already contains a catch-all clause pursuant to which an authorization for the export of non-listed items shall be required if the items in question, in their entirety or in part, are or may be intended for use in connection with WMD or for military end use in an arms embargo country. And the exporter has been informed of this by the competent national authorities. If the exporter is aware of these uses, the exporter is obliged to notify the competent national authorities of this, which shall then decide whether or not to make the export concerned subject to authorization. This catch-all clause can also be found in the new dual-use regulation. So what is new? Next slide, please. New is a catch-all clause for non-listed cyber surveillance items, as you can see on the slide. Regulation 821 introduces in Article 5 a so-called catch-all clause that expands authorization requirements for non-listed items with regard to cyber surveillance items. Authorization shall be required for the export of non-listed items if the exporter has been informed by the competent authority, in Germany it's BAFA, that the respective items are or may be intended in their entirety or in part for use in connection with internal repressions and or the commission of serious violations of human rights and international humanitarian law. Article 5 stipulates an obligation for the exporter to notify the competent national authority, as I said, BAFA, of a critical end use if the exporter is aware of this. It shall then decide whether or not to make the export concerned subject to authorization. However, Article 5 does not cover all non-listed items intended for critical use, but only cyber surveillance items, which are defined as dual-use items, specially designed to enable the covered surveillance of natural persons by monitoring, extracting, collecting, or analyzing data from information and telecommunication systems. Items used for purely commercial applications, such as billing, marketing, quality services, user satisfaction, or network security, are generally considered not to entail such risk and are not covered. BAFA published a leaflet with some guidance for exporters. This will hopefully be available in English on our homepage, I hope at the end of October. In this leaflet, we mentioned a couple of examples about what kind of items are and are not covered by the definition. For example, items for the surveillance of operating status in industry do not constitute cyber surveillance items because they are not specially designed to enable surveillance of natural persons. Furthermore, Article 5 sets out an additional criterion in relation to the notification obligations of the authorities, namely that the exporter is aware of the critical use according to its due diligence findings. Unfortunately, the new regulation does not contain a detailed explanation as to the circumstances under which an exporter is to be deemed aware of a critical use according to its due diligence findings. Next slide, please. However, the new regulation does contain a new definition of internal compliance program, as you can see on this slide. With the word aware, a typical regulatory instrument is used to impose so-called catch-all provisions. From BAFA's point of view, the criterion aware is satisfied only through positive knowledge or awareness, which from a criminal perspective is to be understood in terms of direct intent. However, awareness also exists when the exporter is acquainted with sufficient sources of knowledge from which the exporter can acquire the knowledge in a reasonable way and without special effort. Nor may the exporter deliberately ignore apparent indication. It is improper to willfully look away and intentionally pass up an obvious opportunity to notice something which any other person in such a position would have perceived. Therefore, from BAFA's point of view, the due diligence mentioned in Article 5 is part of the exporter's ICP. Measures for assessing the risk connected with the export are advisable as part of this due diligence transaction-related screening process based on item, destination, and end-user reference points. Next slide, please. Let me conclude my short presentation with some words about further changes. First of all, the new regulation also provides for procedural simplifications in the form of 2 new Union General Export Authorizations. The important one is General Authorization number 007, which covers under several conditions and requirements the intra-company export of most software and technology listed in Annex 1 to now a couple of countries: Argentina, Brazil, Chile, India, Indonesia, Israel, Jordan, Malaysia, Morocco, Mexico, the Philippines, Singapore, South Africa, South Korea, Thailand, and Tunisia. Important point is that the end user has to be a 100% subsidiary of the EU exporter, or the EU exporter and the end user both have to be 100% subsidiaries of a company resident or established in an EU member state. And the exporter intended to use a general authorization number 007 has to have an ICP in place. The new regulation extends the scope of EU dual use controls to the provision of technical assistance related to dual use items. If the supplier of technical assistance has been informed by the competent authority that the items, respectively the technical assistance, in question are or may be intended in their entirety or in part for any of the uses in connection with WMD or military end use in an arms embargo country. At the same time, if the supplier is aware of these uses, the supplier shall notify the competent national authority. Technical assistance, and you see the word on my slide, means under technical support, means any technical support related to repairs, development, manufacture, assembly, testing, maintenance, or any other technical advice, and may take forms such as instruction, advice, training, transmission of working knowledge or skills, or consulting services, including by electronic means as well by telephone or any other verbal forms of assistance. Probably the colleagues from the Netherlands will mention the technical assistance in their presentation about the developments of the guidance and ICP for academia and research institutes as well. Last but not least, the new dual use regulation introduces large project authorizations as a new form of authorization, something we have implemented in Germany as global licenses since many years. And of course, our national legislation had to be adopted accordingly. And with this, I come to the end of my short presentation, and I'm looking forward to the Q&A session. If you have any further questions, please do not hesitate to contact me. You will find my contact data on the last slide of my presentation. Last slide, please, and thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Peach, for the great update. EU has indeed come a long way in the arena of export controls, and I'm sure our audience have benefited from your update on the recent developments. So I'll now turn over to Ms. Wieser and Ms. Bottomer for their update on the development of the guidance and internal compliance program for the academia and research institutions. So Ms. Wieser and Ms. Bottomer, please.
Yes, thank you, and good morning to everybody. Well, let me also start with thanking the organizer from the United States, Japan, and Singapore for organizing this important joint industry outreach seminar and for inviting the Netherlands to have the opportunity and to inform you about the developments in the Netherlands. If it's possible to have my slides shown, that would be helpful. Yes, there they are. Well, let me start. As already mentioned, I'm giving this presentation together with my colleague who's based in the Netherlands, Carina Bottema, and she is the expert. So I will take only a few minutes of your time to explain a little bit of the process and the timeline concerning the topic we will tell you some more about. Carina will explain much more about the details. Well, my name is Gustav Visser and I'm the customs attaché from the Netherlands based in Singapore. And if we can go to the next slide, there we will show our topic, which we would like to share. As Mr. Peach already explained us about the new regulation in the European Union, which is applicable also for the Netherlands. Well, we won't dive into details of those developments, as Mr. Peach gave us a very good overview of the important changes in the regulation. We would like to highlight the dual use aspects for academia and research institutes. Well known, of course, dual use when we really have it about goods. But the dual use aspects for academia and research is now very much in development as well. And that's why we thought it is good to elaborate a little bit more on that. If we can go to the next slide. Yes, this slide is taken on the screen as it is, yeah, the opinion of the Netherlands and of course a lot of others as well, that we all have a piece of the puzzle in our hands when it comes to a safe world. If we go to the next slide, I can explain what I mean with it. It means that we as a competent authority, customs in the case of the Netherlands, have a responsibility in export control, but also business, and more specific for this presentation, research community has a puzzle, a piece of the puzzle. Competent authority, of course, responsible for the policy making, implementing rules, granting authorizations, and the monitoring of the export control and strategic goods. But also these kind of outreach events are very important for us. On business or reside side, it is important to have compliance, to be compliant with the applicable legal requirements, and also to have internal compliance programs, as already mentioned in previous presentations. If we can go to the next slide. As mentioned, these kind of outreach events are also for the Netherlands very important, as we are of the opinion that when you create awareness, then you're empowering. When you know why things are important, what the reasoning behind is, then companies, business and research institutions are more willing and more open and knowing what to do and where to focus on. So that's why, yeah, we are happy that we are able to join this outreach event. If we can go to the next slide. Then I would like to give you some words about the timeline. As mentioned, yeah, in the European Union, there was a Commission proposal in which it was mentioned that the researchers should also be involved in export, or can also be involved in export of dual-use items, and can be involved also in yeah, information which is under this control. So in a proposal of the Commission in 2016, this was already mentioned. And at the same time, there was a technical expert group for ICP. The internal compliance program was set up within the European Union, although this was still mainly for dual use on goods. When we look a little bit later in the timeline, you see that there is more coming to the research and academia. 2019, there was a specific technical expert group set up specifically for research and academia. And this was set up, as mentioned, due to the Commission proposal, in which was already said that also academia and universities are more and more becoming international, have international collaborations. And that's why it's important to focus also on that aspect. The technical expert group set up a guidance for dual-use research, and this guidance, first draft, was published in 2020, and at the same time there was a public consultation on it, as the opinion of the EU was that it shouldn't be a guidance only made by the governmental agencies, but it's also important to have the consultation, the public consultation, to find out where to adjust the guidance. Well, this year the guidance has been adjusted to the summary of the public consultation and the contributions of the public consultation, and it ended up this year in having the guidance published. The next step will be to adjust the guidance to the new regulation, the regulation where Mr. Peach explained us about, 821 from this year to 2021. So that's a little bit about the timeline. And when we have a short look into the next slide, why we have the guidance is to help researchers and research organizations to identify, manage, and mitigate risks, and also to facilitate the compliance with the relevant EU and national laws and regulations. So two main goals which we hope to reach with the guidance. And in the last slide, but I won't dive into details in my last slide, sorry, because there are coming more slides. You can see and perhaps read afterwards when the presentations are shared, read what 4 parts we have in the guidance to get and to reach the goals for the research institutions. So there was a very short presentation about the timeline and the process, how the European Union came towards the guidance. Now my colleague, Carina in the Netherlands, will give us more detail on the regulations, and she will do it by the hand of 2 real-life cases. Carina, you can have the floor.
Yes, thank you very much, Gusta. Good morning to you all. As you see, it's a little dark at my end because for me it's 5:45 in the morning. So I'm going to give 2 examples for dual-use goods, actually. Of course, we all know that regarding academia, a lot of technology is involved, so a lot of knowledge is shared in research consortia within the EU, but also outside of the EU. You can maybe imagine that an aerospace faculty of a university in the Netherlands would collaborate with a university in Singapore on lowering the specific fuel consumption of a miniature gas turbine. Those kind of technology and can be, of course, license required. But as I understood, a lot of companies are here with us. So I've decided to give 2 examples that deal with actual goods that can be exported within these kind of research institutes. So if you could show the next slide, please. And I hope you are still all sharp at the end of your afternoon, because I have 2 poll questions and that you can answer later on to see how you would think, what you think of these kind of examples. So the first example is actually an example that fits the time now. There's in this case, a University of Medicine in EU country 1. So you see the blue dot. That's a country within the EU exports a vial of a virus, the pseudo-rabies virus, to a country in Asia Pacific. For example, Singapore, of course. And the end user is National States Center of Veterinary Medicine. And the end user statement, the end user certificate, states that the end use will be tied to determination of Ojeski's disease virus in Porcellus begonia vaccine as part of random testing according to law on circulation of medicinal products. So this virus is needed for validatory purposes. They need to test the vaccine in order to be able to sell it within their country based on all laws they need to comply to. So that's the case from the Netherlands, or from the EU country. A virus will be exported to a country in Asia Pacific. If we look at the next slide, then you can see that the classification is 1C 351A19 on the EU dual use list. And although this involves vaccine development, the decontrol is not applicable because this ECCN knows a decontrol node, but that does only apply to actual vaccines and not for vaccine development. So when exported, this product needs a license. So if you can click on the next text, please. If we look into open sources and all the information we have, we see that the end use actually fits the end user. You can look into open sources. I use Google all the time when I work, and it shows information about the law. You can find the law in open sources. You can find the organization, the National State Center of Veterinary Medicine in the specific country. You can all find that in open sources, and it shows that they are the authority on these kind of matters. And now I have I think, oh yeah, then I will also, of course, we will look at the vaccine itself. So if you press the button, yeah, you can see that in open sources, this Bordetellus begonia vaccine is actually to protect livestock for the actual Ajeski's disease. So everything fits in that matter. And then we have a question for you all. And I want to ask you to put yourself in my shoes and wonder if you would grant the license. So if you can click on the next, this is the question. Would you grant the license? So I will also fill in. So the answer can be yes, the answer can be B, no, or the answer can be I need more information. That is, of course, very possible. So I want to ask you all to fill in the question, would you grant the license based on the information I just provided? And I have the questions. If you all already answered the questions, then I would love to look at the answers and see what you decided being a licensed officer. Yeah, I see that a lot. Maybe a lot of you need more time to answer the question because I think most of you didn't give an answer. Next time I will give you more time. Then most of you needed more information. Only 1.7% answered no, and 7.1% answered yes. And then if I can give you the answer now, if you can click the next, yes. Based on all the information, that's how we work. We see if everything checks out and if there are any risks regarding the export of a vial of a virus, and the actual decision was that the license was granted. So then on to the next case. This is a very different case. It also involves products. Next slide, please. This was a case in which a country in Asia Pacific, TraceTech Limited, made a product which was an analyzer for traces of explosive, especially designed for use by customs on airport. This is a product that was not license required in the Asia Pacific country itself, and it was imported for temporarily for tests for certification marks. So for European certification mark, a company called Tulip Tech Tests did some tests and sent out a report to EU country 1. If you can please click, because there are some arrows that will be shown. If you can click once. So there was a temporary export and then twice the report was sent to EU2 country 1. So the output is a report. And then in the last click, you can see that the system had to be sent back to the country in Asia Pacific after tests. So there was a temporary import for tests. And then eventually the system was sent back. Next slide, thank you. So if you can click once again, please, the system was classified as 1A004. So this is a license required system for the EU. And the report, which was sent to EU country 2, another country within the EU, involved information on libraries classified as 1E002G. So, but within the EU, there was no license required for the transfer of the report. Then there is one, we have a question, and if you can click, you will probably get the poll question shown now. And if you can click OK, then you will see the question. So the question is, who should apply for the license? Because Tulip Tech tests, they had to re-export the system, of course. TraceTech in Asia Pacific country, they are the actual owner of the system. And that's why we were wondering who should apply for the license. Would it be Tulip Tech tests? So the country who actually did the research, the tests for certification, who will actually send back the system outside of the EU? Would that be TraceTech Limited, the country in Asia Pacific, who is the owner of the system and wants the system back, of course? Is that a customs broker in EU country 1? Or do you need more information to decide on who has to apply for the license? So I will give you some time to answer this question. So I was wondering what the answers are. If you can show the answers. Yes, now I can click on OK. So most of you thought that Tulip Tech tests had to apply for a license. 8% of you chose TraceTech Limited, and some of you answered a customs broker and need more information. So this is a complex situation, and it's hard to really define the actual exporter, because of course Tulip Tech tests is the party in the Netherlands who is involved with the whole transaction. And actually in this scenario, Tulip Tech tests recognized that the system was dual used because they had implemented an ICP. And based on that, Tulip Tech tests told TraceTech Limited that they needed to apply for a license, but of course a country in Asia Pacific cannot apply for a license in the Netherlands. So a possibility would be that TraceTech would have a customs broker in the Netherlands apply for the license if they granted them the authorization and the ownership of the goods. Of course, a choice could be that TraceTech would give Tulip Tech Test the authorization, but the country in the Netherlands decided not to want the responsibility for applying for a license. So in this scenario, TraceTech authorized a subsidiary of their actual country in EU1 requesting the license. So the actual how this situation was solved, that answer wasn't actually in the answers, but a customs broker would be okay. And it depends on what choices they make. But important to know for you as a company send a system to the Netherlands that you want to receive back, of course, on time, then it's important to look at the situation and check whether there are any license requirements and gain information on what this requirement is and how you can gain a license. So these were the two examples. I hope we have provided you with a little more details or a little more information on situations that you as a company can be involved in regarding research and academia. As you see, there has been a lot of development on different in different countries, and a lot of attention for this whole branch of research and academia, because of course it is a very important aspect of the whole dual use control system. So thank you very much for your time, and if there are any questions, then I would be happy to answer them.
Thank you, Ms. Wieser and Ms. Bottomer, for your excellent sharing. I do share your views on the importance of awareness, and awareness is indeed empowering. So the two scenarios shared are also really insightful. Okay, so finally, we will have Ms. Kim to share with us on South Korea's export licensing procedures. Ms. Kim, over to you, please.
Hello, everybody. My name is Mi-young Kim. I'm Deputy Director of Trade Control Policy of MOTI Korea. First of all, thank you very much for organizing this important seminar and having me an opportunity for introducing Korean's export control system. Before I'll introduce the specific procedure, I'll give you a brief summary about recent changes of Korean government export control system. In order to respond to changes in the trade security environment, MOTI reorganized the organization last year. We expanded from one division to one bureau, including 3 divisions: Trade Controls Policy Division, Export Control Licensing Division, and Technologies Transfer Control Division. We also enhanced manpower from around 10 to 30 people. Through this reorganization, we also unified trade control tasks such as prevention of leakage of strategic material and technology, and strengthened export management expertise. The next slide, please. Okay, I'll give you a brief summary about our procedure. Next slide, please. Okay, now I'll introduce the export licensing procedure in Korea. South Korea's export control system operates basically in accordance with international standards. We control the export of items that have high potential of being diverted into weapons in accordance with the 4 international export control regimes, so as to protect international peace and national security. Most important legal ground of export control system is Foreign Trade Act. Strategic goods is designated by Foreign Trade Act and related regulation and ordinances. And almost 1,600 materials and technologies are designated now. Next slide, please. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, MOTI oversees comprehensively about export control of strategic goods in practice, but the authority of export licensing is divided by 3 different agencies. Previous slide. Okay. The authority of export licensing is divided by 3 different agencies. Licensing agencies vary by controlled item type. MODI is in charge of dual-use item, and DAPA, Defense Acquisition Program Administration, is in charge of military-use items. And NSSC, Nuclear Safety and Security Commission, is in charge of nuclear-use item. Slide here, the licensing procedure is divided into 4 stages, but try to be more simply, it can be explained in 2 stages. Next slide, please. Okay, the first stage is the classification of strategic items. Companies that want to export strategic goods can apply for professional classification to COSTI and classifying by themselves to determine whether the item is a strategic or not. COSTI is in charge of classifying professionally in accordance with the law. According to the result of classifying, if the item is strategic, it should obtain export permission, and otherwise, if it is not strategic items, it can be exported without permission. Next slide, please. Okay, that was the first stage of export control, and the second stage is the assessment for licensing. If the item is determined as a strategic good by classifying, companies should apply for export permission to government such as MODI, DAPA, and NSSC. The assessment for licensing shall be conducted in accordance with the principle of 4 international regimes, and a review of end use and end user is quite strict. Next slide, please. Okay, I'll give you the explain of the post-control. The illegal export of strategic item is subject to strict penalties according to the Foreign Trade Act. Up to 7 years of imprisonment or a fine of up to 5 times the value of transaction. In addition, administrative sanctions such as export restriction, training and educations, and the announcement of the list will be imposed for a certain period of time.
Licensing procedures, post-control, and the amendments to public notice on trade of strategic items. It's insightful to note your updates. So for Q&A, please give me a moment. I see one for Ms. Kim. Okay. Ms. Kim, is there any information available on transit or transshipment requirement in South Korea that's published in English? That's one question. And there is a second one on where can we find the latest list published by South Korea on individual and entity against North Korea? That's in English.
영문적 관련해서 영문으로
네네.
대한민국 영문법령 사이트에 들어가면
regarding the recent changes toward North Korea, we publish on our English website a Korean law site. I will answer that question by the chat.
Thank you. Okay, I note that there aren't further questions. There are new ones that came in. So 2 more questions that came in for Ms. Kim. The first one, under Korea export regulation, if exporter wish to submit export license, but at the time of export, overseas end user is unknown, who can complete the end user statement? For example, the control item is exported for staging purposes for sales.
수출할 때 확정이 돼 있어야 하는데 안 되면 컨디션 서치를 받아.
I'll check later and I'll answer to her later by chat. Sorry.
Yes, thank you, Ms. Kim. Finally, there's a last question, which states this is specific to Korea export licensing system. I understood that there is a scheme to apply for exemption license for dual-use items. Could you confirm if this scheme is still available?
Regarding compliance program system, if one company try to be a compliance program trader, they need to apply for MODI. They want to be a compliant CP trader. If they got a license to be a CP trader, they can get a special favor like exemption. But I can give the more detail to Mr. Young, maybe by chatting.
Thank you, Ms. Kim. Okay, there were a couple of questions in the Q&A chat which our panel has already addressed. I'm also mindful of the time, so if there are no further questions, please allow me to thank our panel for joining us today. I've personally benefited tremendously from today's sharing, so I'll now hand over back to Dan. Dan, please.
Thank you so much, Ms. Lim, and thank you to our final panelists of the day. As mentioned beforehand, I think the audience was quite interested to hear updates on national export control laws and regulations. And I thought all of the presenters gave us an excellent overview of what's happening in their countries. So we're over time, so let's wrap up now. Let me thank again all of you, the panelists and the moderators for today. And I hope all of you in attendance had your questions answered. Please follow up via email with the panelists if you feel like your question wasn't answered yet. I'm also looking forward to continuing the discussion tomorrow during day 2 of the seminar. Julie, can you put the day 2 agenda up on the screen for us? Tomorrow during day 2, we'll open with a keynote presentation from Mr. Kevin Kurland, who's the Assistant Secretary at the U.S. Department of Commerce. And we're going to follow that with a session to explore national developments in strategic trade controls and regulation, a look at managing supply chain risks and internal compliance plan best practices, and a panel on ITT and IPR. So I think we'll have some very interesting discussions. Julie, are you able to share the day 2 agenda for the audience just to see it one last time? There we go. Okay, so there's the day 2 agenda. So I hope you'll join us tomorrow for that. Thank you all for attending today. Hopefully we'll see you tomorrow and we'll have a lot of interesting discussions tomorrow. But until then, goodbye and have a nice day or a nice evening. Thank you.